Napoleon Bonaparte's story begins far from the grand boulevards of Paris on a rugged island in the Mediterranean Sea. He was born in the town of Ajaccio on Corsica in August of 1769, only a few months after France had taken control of the island from the Republic of Genoa. That timing mattered. Napoleon was born into a world where old powers were fading and new ones were rising, where identities and loyalties were being reshaped by force and by law. His family, the Bonapartes, were part of the minor Corsican nobility. They were not rich, but they had status and education. His father, Carlo Buonaparte, had once supported the Corsican resistance leader Pasquale Paoli against the French. But when it became clear that France would dominate the island, Carlo chose to collaborate and secure a place for his family in the new order. This decision, driven by survival and ambition, opened doors for Napoleon that would otherwise have remained closed. In a sense, his rise began with his father's choice to bend with history rather than be broken by it. Because Corsica had become French, Napoleon could attend French schools. As a boy, he was sent to the mainland, first to a school at Autun and then to the military academy at Brienne. There he was an outsider in nearly every way. His accent was different, his French was initially poor, and classmates mocked him as a rough provincial from a conquered island. These experiences left marks. They sharpened his sense of pride, of being underestimated, of needing to prove himself through achievement and discipline rather than birth and wealth. At Brienne, and later at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, Napoleon studied mathematics, artillery, and military history. He read about ancient generals and modern strategy, and he developed a strong belief that skill and energy could overcome tradition and privilege. Financial problems at home forced him to complete his training quickly. He graduated ahead of schedule and became a young artillery officer, commissioned into the French army in the mid-1780s. At this point, France was still a monarchy under King Louis XVI, and few could have predicted how quickly the ground would shift. But the kingdom was already in deep trouble. Years of expensive wars, including support for the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. Social tensions were growing between the privileged estates and the common people. Enlightenment ideas about rights and sovereignty were spreading in books, pamphlets, and salons. When the Estates General met in 1789 and the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, the old order began to crack. For a young officer like Napoleon, the French Revolution was both a danger and an opportunity. The collapse of the traditional system meant that noble lineage would no longer be the only path to promotion. On the other hand, political upheaval, purges, and factional violence could destroy an officer's career or life overnight. Napoleon initially spent time in Corsica during these early revolutionary years, trying to navigate his loyalty between the island and the new France. He at first admired Pasquale Paoli, the old Corsican patriot, but soon their paths diverged. Paoli turned against the French Revolution, while Napoleon and his family increasingly tied their future to revolutionary France. When conflict broke out on the island, the Bonapartes chose France and were driven into exile, escaping to the mainland as refugees. This forced break with Corsica pushed Napoleon to commit fully to his career in the French army. As the revolution radicalized in the early 1790s, France found itself at war with many of the old monarchies of Europe. Revolutionary France faced coalitions of enemies: Austria, Prussia, and later Britain and others. Internally, royalist revolts and counter-revolutionary uprisings threatened to tear the country apart. The government in Paris needed competent officers, especially in artillery, which had become increasingly important on the battlefield. Napoleon's technical skill, his ability to move and concentrate guns, and his willingness to act decisively began to set him apart. His first major moment on the national stage came at the Siege of Toulon in 1793. Toulon, a key naval base in the south of France, had risen against the revolutionary government and invited British and Spanish forces into its harbor. Retaking Toulon was essential, not only for military reasons, but also for the government's legitimacy. Napoleon, at this time a relatively unknown young captain of artillery, was sent to support the besieging French forces. At Toulon, he showed the combination of technical understanding and bold initiative that would become his trademark. He proposed placing batteries on key heights that would dominate the harbor and make it impossible for the enemy fleet to stay. After some resistance from superiors, his plan was accepted. Once the French guns were in position and opened fire, they made the harbor untenable. The Allied fleet had to withdraw, and Toulon fell back into French hands. This victory mattered far beyond the local battlefield. It saved an important port, restored a shattered prestige, and gave the revolutionary government a badly needed success. Napoleon's performance earned him promotion to brigadier general. It also brought him to the attention of powerful men who would later help or hinder his rise. But the political climate was still extremely unstable. The reign of terror under Robespierre made careers fragile. A single accusation could lead to prison or the guillotine. Napoleon himself fell under suspicion at one point and was briefly arrested. That he survived had much to do with timing and caution, and perhaps with luck. After the fall of Robespierre in 1794, the revolution entered a new phase. The most radical leaders had been executed, but France was still at war and the economy was in crisis. Food shortages, inflation, and exhaustion were everywhere. The new government, known as the Directory, was weak and widely distrusted. It relied heavily on the army to maintain order and to win victories that would bring money and resources from abroad. Napoleon's path crossed with the Directory's needs in a decisive way in the autumn of 1795. In Paris, royalist forces and opponents of the revolution attempted an uprising against the Convention, the legislative body that preceded the Directory. The government needed someone efficient and loyal to crush this threat quickly. Napoleon, who was then in Paris and had already shown both skill and reliability, was assigned to defend the revolutionary authorities. What followed became famous as the whiff of grape shot. Napoleon organized the defense of the government by placing artillery in key positions and using them against the advancing insurgents. When the royalist columns moved toward the center of Paris, his guns fired canister shot at close range, tearing through the ranks and breaking the attack. It was a brutal but effective use of force. The uprising collapsed, and the revolutionaries kept control of the capital. This moment had deep consequences. It made Napoleon the man who had saved the revolution from a royalist comeback, at least in the eyes of those in power. The Directory now saw him as a dependable instrument, someone who could use military power to protect the regime. It also showed Napoleon that political authority in France now rested not only on ideas and laws, but on the controlled use of violence. Force, when applied quickly and decisively, could settle political questions. From a broader perspective, Napoleon's rise between 1789 and 1795 illustrates how the turmoil of the French Revolution opened paths for talented individuals who would have remained minor figures under the monarchy. The old aristocratic hierarchy had been broken. Many noble officers had emigrated or been purged. The new revolutionary state desperately needed competent commanders. Promotions came faster, and merit, or at least perceived usefulness to the regime, mattered more than family background. By the late 1790s, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer just a promising general. His victories in Italy had made him a national figure and a potential political threat to the leaders of the Directory in Paris. They admired his success, but they also feared his popularity. At the same time, the great unresolved problem of the age remained Britain. As long as Britain controlled the seas and financed coalitions against France, the French Republic could not feel secure. Out of this mix of ambition, fear, and strategic frustration came one of the most unusual campaigns of Napoleon's career, the expedition to Egypt. Instead of attempting a direct invasion of Britain, which would require a naval strength France did not possess, Napoleon proposed a different idea. He suggested striking at British power indirectly by seizing Egypt. Control of Egypt, with its position between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, could threaten British trade routes to India, the cornerstone of British imperial wealth. France had long dreamed of expanding its influence in the eastern Mediterranean. Now, with Napoleon offering both military leadership and a vision of glory, the Directory accepted. The expedition that sailed from Toulon in the summer of 1798 was more than a simple army. Alongside tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors, Napoleon took with him a large group of scientists, engineers, artists, and scholars. Mathematicians, naturalists, architects, and orientalists joined the fleet. This mixture of war and science reflected the spirit of the French Revolution, which claimed to spread not only political change, but also knowledge and progress. Napoleon wanted to present himself not just as a conqueror, but as a bringer of civilization. On the way to Egypt, the French forces captured Malta from the Knights of St. John, securing a strategic base. From there, they sailed onward, trying to avoid the British fleet commanded by Admiral Horatio Nelson. For a time, they succeeded. The French landed near Alexandria in early July, surprising the local authorities and the Mamluk rulers who controlled Egypt in the name of the Ottoman Sultan. The landing itself, under the fierce heat of the Egyptian summer, was difficult, but Napoleon wasted no time. He pushed his army inland, heading toward Cairo. The Mamluks, famous for their cavalry and their long tradition of military rule, prepared to confront the invaders. The decisive encounter came near the Nile, at a place often referred to as the Battle of the Pyramids, though the fighting took place some distance from the actual monuments. Facing superior cavalry, Napoleon formed his infantry into large squares, bristling with bayonets and supported by artillery. The Mamluk charges crashed against these disciplined formations and broke. French firepower and organization overcame the courage of the mounted warriors. By the end of the day, the Mamluk forces were shattered, and Cairo soon fell into French hands. Militarily, the campaign on land began with clear success. Politically, Napoleon moved quickly to present himself as a liberator rather than a mere invader. He issued proclamations claiming respect for Islam and for local customs, insisting that he came to free Egypt from oppressive rulers. He tried to work with religious and local elites, forming councils and presenting the French as allies of the people. At the same time, he imposed heavy contributions and controlled the country through military power and a network of intelligence. His rule combined promises of reform with strict security measures. While Napoleon secured his position on land, events at sea transformed the strategic picture. The French fleet that had carried the army to Egypt anchored in Abu Qir Bay near the Nile Delta. There it was discovered by Admiral Nelson. In a bold night attack now known as the Battle of the Nile, the British fleet smashed the French ships. Many vessels were destroyed or captured. The French flagship blew up in a massive explosion. When the battle was over, the British controlled the eastern Mediterranean, and the French army in Egypt was effectively cut off from home. This naval disaster changed everything. Napoleon's gambit had turned into a strategic trap. He still held Egypt, but now he had no secure sea route back to France, no easy way to receive reinforcements, and no control over the surrounding waters. For the Directory in Paris, the expedition became a liability. For Britain, it was a great victory, proving once again the importance of naval supremacy. Napoleon, however, did not immediately collapse. Instead, he doubled down on his attempt to reshape Egypt and to expand his campaign on land. In Cairo and other cities, the scholars who had accompanied the army began their work. They founded the Institute of Egypt, studied ancient monuments, measured the land, and collected artifacts. Their efforts would later be gathered into the vast publication known as the Description of Egypt. During these studies, a French officer discovered a stone slab near the town of Rosetta, bearing inscriptions in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. This Rosetta Stone would eventually become the key to deciphering ancient Egyptian writing, though that achievement came years later in the hands of scholars in Europe. The presence of these scientists and their work gave the Egyptian expedition a lasting cultural and intellectual legacy, even as the military situation deteriorated. Napoleon, always restless, soon looked beyond Egypt itself. To secure his position and to strike at the Ottoman Empire, which had now joined the war against France, he led a campaign into Syria in early 1799. The march across the desert was harsh. The army suffered from shortages of water and disease. In several towns, including Jaffa, the fighting was brutal, and French control relied on force rather than consent. Accounts from this campaign include grim stories of executions and of a plague outbreak among the troops, episodes that damaged Napoleon's later efforts to present the expedition in purely heroic terms. The most important military test of this Syrian campaign came at Acre, a fortified city on the coast. Napoleon hoped that taking Acre would give him a strong base and inspire a wider uprising against the Ottoman authorities. However, the defense of the city, supported by British naval power and directed by capable commanders such as the British officer Sidney Smith, proved stubborn. French assaults failed repeatedly. Artillery was insufficient, supplies were short, and disease ravaged the besieging army. After weeks of effort, Napoleon was forced to abandon the siege and retreat back toward Egypt. The failed attempt at Acre marked a turning point. It showed that Napoleon's methods could be blocked when opponents combined strong fortifications, naval support, and determined leadership. For the French soldiers, the retreat under hard conditions reduced morale. The dream of a sweeping Eastern Empire stretching through the Middle East began to fade. Back in Cairo, Napoleon tried to repair the situation, winning another land victory against an Ottoman army at Abu Qir in the summer of 1799. But the underlying strategic isolation remained. All this time, news from France had been reaching Napoleon in fragments. The Directory was struggling with financial problems, political scandals, and the continuing burden of war in Europe. Public confidence in the government was low. The military, which had once been a tool of the revolution, was now in many minds the only stable and effective institution in the country. Generals who commanded loyal armies were becoming political actors, whether they wished to or not. Among them, Napoleon was already famous for his victories and his daring. He understood that his position in Egypt, cut off by sea and limited by geography, no longer offered a path to greater power. Instead, it threatened to trap him in a distant and increasingly costly adventure. In a move that revealed both his ambition and his willingness to take personal risks, he decided to leave his army in Egypt and return to France. The decision was controversial, and many of his officers and soldiers felt abandoned. Yet Napoleon judged that the greater opportunity lay in Paris, not on the Nile. In late 1799, he quietly embarked on a small ship and slipped past the British blockade, taking advantage of luck and poor weather. The journey was dangerous, but he reached France safely. When he landed, he discovered that the public knew little of the true situation in Egypt. Instead, they remembered the early victories and the image he had cultivated of himself as a brilliant commander and enlightened leader. Reports of the naval disaster and the harsh Syrian campaign had been softened or overshadowed. Napoleon and his allies understood the power of controlling information. As he traveled to Paris, crowds greeted him with enthusiasm. For many French citizens, weary of instability and corruption, he represented energy, order, and success. The Directory, already unpopular, now had to deal with the sudden return of a general whose reputation towered over that of most politicians. Behind closed doors, conversations began among key figures who were dissatisfied with the existing system and searching for a way to replace it with something more stable and more centralized. When Napoleon Bonaparte returned from Egypt in the autumn of 1799, he stepped back into a France that was exhausted, suspicious, and unsure of its future. The revolution had overthrown the monarchy and fought off foreign invaders, but it had also passed through years of terror, civil war, and economic crisis. The government now in power, known as the Directory, was weak and unpopular. Many French people felt that the revolution had lost its way. The Directory was made up of 5 directors who shared executive authority. In theory, this was meant to prevent any single person from seizing power. In practice, it produced instability and constant intrigue. The directors fought among themselves, plotted against factions in the legislature, and relied heavily on the army to intervene whenever political opponents grew too bold. Corruption was widespread, elections were often manipulated, and the gap between revolutionary ideals and daily reality grew wider each year. Meanwhile, France remained at war. On the frontiers, French armies faced renewed pressure from Austria, Russia, and their allies. Defeats in Italy and Germany weakened confidence in the regime. Inside the country, royalists hoped to restore the monarchy, while radical republicans opposed what they saw as a betrayal of the revolution. Many moderates simply wanted peace and order. In this chaotic landscape, a strong and successful general like Napoleon appeared to many as a possible savior. One of the key political figures looking for change was Emmanuel Sieyès, a priest-turned-revolutionary thinker, best known for his earlier pamphlet asking, "What is the Third Estate?" By 1799, he was one of the directors and deeply dissatisfied with the structure of the Directory. He dreamed of a new constitution with a stronger executive power, one that could stabilize France and protect the achievements of the revolution without returning to royal absolutism. However, Sieyès knew he did not have the personal authority or military backing to carry out such a transformation alone. He needed a sword, and Napoleon was the obvious candidate. When Napoleon arrived in Paris, Sieyès and other discontented politicians approached him. They had been planning a constitutional change, but their scheme lacked energy and a clear figure to rally around. Napoleon brought both. He understood that the moment was ripe. The government was discredited, the economy strained, and the people tired. If he moved decisively, he could present a seizure of power not as a betrayal of the revolution, but as its rescue. The plan that took shape in the autumn of that year was a mixture of legal maneuver and raw force. The conspirators decided to use the Council of Ancients, one of the legislative bodies, to give a veneer of legality to their actions. The idea was to claim that Paris was in danger from a supposed Jacobin plot, then legally transferred the legislature to the nearby palace of St. Cloud, where it would be easier to control. Napoleon would be given command of the troops responsible for the security of the capital. Under the cover of this arrangement, the conspirators would then pressure the deputies to dissolve the Directory and approve a new constitution. On the day known in the revolutionary calendar as 18th Brumaire, the first step unfolded. The Council of Ancients, already influenced by the conspirators, voted to move the legislative bodies to St. Cloud and granted Napoleon command of the military forces around Paris. He accepted the role with a show of reluctant duty, claiming that he was only acting to protect the Republic. Soldiers loyal to him took positions across the city, guarding key points and intimidating potential opponents. The directors themselves were divided. Sieyès and Roger Ducos resigned as planned, clearing the way for change. The remaining directors, including Paul Barras, hesitated. Under pressure and sensing that resistance would be dangerous, they also stepped aside or were forced out. On paper, the executive body of the Directory was now broken. In reality, power had shifted to Napoleon and his allies, but the transformation was not yet complete. The legislature still had to be dealt with. The next day, 19th Brumaire, events became more chaotic and more revealing. At St. Cloud, the deputies of the two councils gathered, suspicious and uneasy. Many did not fully understand what was happening. They knew that the Directory had collapsed, but they feared both a return to royal rule and a military dictatorship. Some were ready to accept a new constitution that promised stability, while others were determined to defend the existing republican framework. Napoleon arrived to address the Council of Ancients in person. He spoke of the dangers threatening France, of factions and corruption, of the need for a firm and honest government. His speech, however, was not well received. He then entered the Council of 500, the lower chamber, where opposition was stronger. There, the atmosphere grew tense. Some deputies shouted that he was a violator of the Constitution, that he should be declared outside the law. At one point, members surged toward him, and he had to be escorted out by soldiers. It was his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who played a crucial role in the final act. As president of the Council of 500, Lucien claimed that armed extremists inside the chamber were threatening the legislature itself. Using this as justification, he called on the troops outside to intervene. Grenadiers loyal to Napoleon marched into the hall and cleared it by force. Many deputies fled. Those who remained were then persuaded, under pressure, to approve decrees dissolving the Directory and establishing a provisional consulate. With this, the coup was complete. The events of 18th and 19th Brumaire ended the Directory and replaced it with a new regime. Although there had been talk of constitutional reform and legislative approval, the decisive factor had been the army. Napoleon had used his popularity and control over the soldiers to intimidate politicians and drive through a revolutionary change of his own. Yet he was careful to present the outcome as a legal and necessary correction, rather than a crude seizure of power. The Provisional Consulate was at first led by 3 consuls, Napoleon, Cas, and Roger Ducos. This arrangement, however, did not last long. Within weeks, Cas found himself marginalized. Napoleon and his circle, including close advisors like Talleyrand, guided the drafting of a new constitution that concentrated real power in the hands of the first consul. The new basic law, known as the Constitution of Year 8, created a complex structure of assemblies and councils that gave an appearance of representation, but most of the important decisions flowed downward from the executive. Under this constitution, the first consul held a long term of office, controlled appointments, commanded the army, and had the initiative in legislation. The other consuls had only consultative roles. Elections were formally preserved, but they were indirect and tightly managed. Citizens voted to create lists of notables, from which the government selected officials. The system was designed to filter popular opinion through layers of control, ensuring that the state remained stable and that Napoleon remained at its center. To give this new arrangement legitimacy, the regime organized a plebiscite asking citizens to approve the constitution. The vote, conducted under the watchful eye of the authorities, produced a result that the government announced as an overwhelming endorsement. Whether or not the numbers were fully accurate, there is little doubt that many French people did welcome the change. After years of uncertainty, they hoped that a strong executive might bring order, protect property, and end the constant shifts of the revolutionary years. As first consul, Napoleon moved quickly to consolidate his position. He established his residence in the Tuileries Palace, once home to the kings of France, symbolically placing himself at the heart of power. He reorganized the ministries, replaced unreliable officials, and built a disciplined administrative machine. Censorship tightened around the press. Political clubs that might foster opposition were restricted or shut down. At the same time, he offered an amnesty to many émigrés who had fled during the revolution, on the condition that they accepted the new order and refrained from agitation. Militarily, the new regime had to secure its survival by reversing recent setbacks. Austria remained a major threat, and the Italian front was once again central. In the spring of 1800, Napoleon launched a campaign that would become one of his most famous early operations. Leading an army across the Alps by unexpected passes, he aimed to surprise the Austrians and recover the ground that had been lost since his earlier campaigns. The key battle of this campaign took place near the town of Marengo in northern Italy. The fighting was hard and, for much of the day, went badly for the French. Austrian forces under General Melas pushed Napoleon's troops back and seemed close to victory. However, the arrival of a French reserve corps late in the day, along with determined counterattacks, turned the tide. The Austrians were driven from the field. Strategically, the battle restored French dominance in northern Italy and strengthened Napoleon's image as a leader who could snatch victory from the brink of defeat. The diplomatic results followed soon after. Austria agreed to negotiations that led to the Treaty of Luneville, confirming French gains and reducing Habsburg influence in Italy and on the Rhine. On other fronts, French victories and pressure encouraged Russia to withdraw from the war. Britain, still at sea and unwilling to abandon its naval supremacy, remained the main enemy. But even there, the prospect of a pause in fighting grew stronger. By 1802, after long and complex talks, France and Britain signed the Peace of Amiens. For the first time in many years, Europe experienced a general peace. French troops remained in control of many territories across the continent, while Britain kept its colonies and its fleet. In France, the Peace of Amiens was greeted with relief and celebration. It seemed to confirm that the new regime under the Consulate could deliver what the Directory had failed to provide: stability, victory, and an end, at least for a time, to endless war. With the Consulate established and the immediate military threats pushed back, Napoleon Bonaparte turned his attention to something deeper than battles or coups. He wanted to rebuild France from the inside. The chaotic years of the Revolution had broken the old order, but they had not yet created a stable new one. Between roughly the turn of the century and the proclamation of the Empire, Napoleon used his position as first consul to construct a new political and social system. This was the true foundation of the Napoleonic Empire, built long before he put a crown on his head. At the heart of his project was a simple idea: power had to be centralized. Revolutionary France had seen elected councils, local experiments, and strong popular movements. These had played a role in defeating the monarchy and mobilizing the nation, but they had also produced confusion, rival authorities, and sometimes chaos. Napoleon believed that a strong state required clear lines of command from the center to the localities, and that local autonomy had to give way to administrative discipline. To achieve this, he reorganized the French territory into departments, districts, and communes under a strict hierarchy of appointed officials. The key figure in this structure was the prefect. Each department received a prefect, chosen by the central government and responsible directly to the first consul and his ministers. The prefect oversaw taxation, policing, public works, and the enforcement of laws. Under the prefect stood sub-prefects and mayors, also appointed rather than freely elected. This system ensured that orders from Paris passed quickly and reliably down through the country, and that any sign of unrest or opposition could be reported back up the chain. This administrative network turned France into a highly controlled and efficient state. On the one hand, it meant that reforms could be applied everywhere in a relatively uniform way. On the other, it sharply reduced the kind of local democracy that had once inspired parts of the revolution. The balance clearly favored authority over participation. For Napoleon, this was the price of stability, and he was willing to pay it. The question of religion posed another major challenge. The revolution had deeply damaged relations between the state and the Catholic Church. Church lands had been seized, clergy had been persecuted or forced to swear oaths, and in many places, traditional religious life had been disrupted. By the time Napoleon came to power, millions of ordinary French people, especially in rural areas, felt alienated by these policies. At the same time, many supporters of the revolution feared a full return of clerical influence. Reconciling these tensions required careful negotiation. Napoleon's solution was the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, signed in the early years of the Consulate. This agreement restored public worship and recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens, without making it the official state religion. The Pope accepted that the lands confiscated during the Revolution would not be returned and that bishops would be nominated by the government, though they were to be confirmed by Rome. Priests would be paid by the state, which ensured their dependence on the government. The Concordat had several important effects. It calmed religious tensions, reassuring believers that their faith could once again be practiced openly. It brought many former opponents of the revolution back into some form of loyalty to the new regime. At the same time, it reinforced state authority over the church, placing the clergy under close supervision. Napoleonic France would not be a theocratic country, but neither would it be aggressively anti-religious. Instead, religion became another institution absorbed into the machinery of the state. Alongside administrative and religious reform came one of Napoleon's most lasting achievements, the creation of a new civil law code. Before the Revolution, France had been a patchwork of local laws and customs. The Revolution had proclaimed equality before the law, but legal practice remained inconsistent. As first consul, Napoleon supported the drafting of a comprehensive civil code that would unify and simplify the legal system. A team of jurists worked under his close supervision, especially in the early years of the Consulate. The resulting text, later known as the Napoleonic Code or Civil Code, drew on both revolutionary principles and older legal traditions. It confirmed the abolition of feudal privileges, established equality before the law for male citizens, protected private property, and secularized civil life. At the same time, it reinforced paternal authority within the family, making the husband and father the legal head of the household. Women's rights remained limited. Married women, for example, had narrow legal independence. Divorce was permitted, but under conditions that favored men. The code mattered not only because of its content, but because of its method. It defined laws in clear, accessible language and applied them uniformly across France. Over time, versions of this code would spread to other parts of Europe and beyond, influencing legal systems in many countries. It embodied the Napoleonic balance between revolutionary change and traditional hierarchy. Equality and merit in public life, combined with order and obedience in private life and in the family. To support this new state structure, Napoleon also reformed finance and the economy. The revolution had left French finances in disarray. Inflation, unstable paper money, and irregular taxation had undermined trust. Napoleon's government sought to restore confidence by creating the Bank of France, a central institution that would help manage the currency and stabilize credit. The state introduced more regular systems of taxation, including direct taxes on land and indirect taxes on certain goods. Collection was overseen by the same administrative network of prefects and officials, reducing opportunities for local corruption. Although many taxpayers grumbled, the new system provided the consulate with a more predictable flow of money. That revenue was essential for supporting the army, funding public works, and paying civil servants. It allowed Napoleon to present himself as a ruler who could bring financial order after years of chaos. The connection between fiscal reform and military strength was especially important. A state that could reliably collect taxes could also sustain large standing armies, build roads, and prepare for future wars. Education formed another pillar of the Napoleonic system. Napoleon believed that the state needed loyal, competent officials and officers, and that citizens should be shaped by common values. He did not want education to be left entirely to the church or to private initiative. Under his direction, the government created a structured national system centered on secondary schools called lycées. These schools were designed to train the sons of the middle classes and of officers, particularly in subjects useful to the state: mathematics, science, history, and the study of classical languages. The curriculum emphasized discipline, merit, and loyalty to the regime. Scholarships were offered to talented students, including sons of soldiers who had died in the service of France. This reinforced the idea that the new elite would be based on service and achievement, not just birth. At the top of the system, specialized schools prepared engineers, administrators, and officers. Together, these institutions supplied Napoleon's France with a cadre of technically skilled and politically reliable servants of the state. All these reforms were backed by a powerful internal security apparatus. Joseph Fouché, Napoleon's Minister of Police, built a network of informers and agents across the country. The press was tightly controlled. Newspapers that criticized the government could be closed, and printers who stepped out of line faced punishment. Political opposition did not disappear, but it became dangerous to express it openly. By controlling information and suppressing dissent, the regime reduced the risk of sudden uprisings or conspiracies. At the same time, Napoleon understood the importance of rewarding loyalty and creating visible symbols of honor. In this spirit, he founded the Legion of Honor, an order that recognized military and civil merit. Members received a distinctive cross and, more importantly, public recognition of their service to France. The Legion was open, at least in theory, to men from all social backgrounds. A peasant's son could stand beside a nobleman as a member if he had served with distinction. This helped legitimize the regime as a meritocracy, even while it quietly restored some practices reminiscent of the old nobility. Napoleon also reintroduced certain outward signs of hierarchy and ceremony. While France remained officially a republic during the Consulate, Public rituals, grand receptions, and formal titles surrounded the first consul. Portraits portrayed him in a semi-regal style, with laurel wreaths or draped cloaks that recalled ancient Rome. In public festivals, he was celebrated as the savior of the revolution and the embodiment of French glory. The line between a republican leader and a monarch in all but name grew increasingly thin. These domestic changes had a clear logic. By centralizing administration, reconciling with the church, codifying the law, stabilizing finances, shaping education, and policing opinion, Napoleon created a state that was both strong and flexible. It could mobilize resources rapidly, maintain internal order, and project power abroad. It offered many citizens security, careers, and a sense that their talents would be rewarded while leaving little room for independent political life or deep opposition. There were also tensions and limits. Some former revolutionaries felt that the gains of earlier years were being hollowed out. They saw the reduction of local democracy, the tight control of the press, and the restoration of male dominance in the family as betrayals of the ideals of liberty and equality. On the other side, hardcore royalists regarded the regime as an illegitimate continuation of the revolution, no matter how many traditional elements it adopted. Yet both extremes were, for the moment, contained by a combination of repression and success. As long as the state delivered order, prosperity, and national pride, the majority accepted or even supported it. By the early years of the new century, Napoleon Bonaparte had already become the central figure in French political life. As first consul, he controlled the army, directed foreign policy, oversaw the administration, and drove through sweeping reforms in law, religion, finance, and education. On paper, France was still a republic born from the revolution. In reality, it was increasingly clear that one man stood above the rest. The transformation from consulate to empire did not happen overnight, but when it came, it formalized a power structure that already existed. Several forces pushed France toward this change. One was the continued sense of insecurity. The revolution had overthrown a king and fought off foreign invaders, but many French people still feared the return of the Bourbon dynasty. Royalist plots persisted, some aimed at assassination, others at insurrection. At the same time, the revolution had produced its own radicals, who resented the tightening grip of the consulate and dreamt of reviving earlier, more democratic phases. To supporters of Napoleon, these dangers justified concentrating power even more firmly in his hands. Only a strong, stable authority, they argued, could protect the gains of the revolution and prevent a slide back into chaos or monarchy. There was also the question of legitimacy in the eyes of Europe. Most of the traditional powers still followed monarchical forms. Kings and emperors made alliances, exchanged dynastic marriages, and recognized each other's titles. A French republic led by a powerful general did not fit comfortably into this system. Elevating Napoleon from first consul to emperor of the French would, in the eyes of his supporters, place him on an equal footing with other sovereigns, and give France a place in the familiar language of crowns and dynasties. Finally, there was Napoleon's own ambition. He had risen from minor Corsican nobility to the head of a great state. He had reshaped institutions and won battles that made him a hero to many. For such a man, the idea of founding a new dynasty and carving his name permanently into history was extremely attractive. Yet even his ambition needed suitable circumstances and a language that could win over a large part of French society. The immediate push toward imperial rule was strengthened by a dramatic event: the discovery of a royalist plot to kill Napoleon. This conspiracy, involving figures from the old aristocratic world and some discontented officers, was uncovered by the police and used by the regime to argue that the life of the first consul was essential to the nation. If he were assassinated, who would hold France together? Who would guarantee the new institutions, the peace in the countryside, and the victories abroad? The threat of assassination thus became a powerful argument for a more secure, hereditary form of leadership. In the political circles around Napoleon, a consensus began to form. Senators, ministers, and high officials, many of whom owed their careers to the consulate, urged him to accept a new title. They framed the change not as a betrayal of the revolution, but as a way of protecting it. The empire, they said, would be a crowned republic, where the principles of property, equality before the law, and the end of feudal privilege would be maintained, but under the guardianship of an imperial family. The Senate, a body created under the Consulate and loyal to Napoleon, played a central role in the formal transition. At Napoleon's urging and under his influence, it drafted a proposal to alter the Constitution. This new text declared Napoleon Emperor of the French and made the dignity hereditary in his family, with arrangements for succession. The wording was careful. He was not simply Emperor of France, as if the country were his personal possession, but Emperor of the French, a title meant to suggest that his authority came from the people, not from divine right or ancient tradition. To legitimize this change, the regime turned once again to a plebiscite. Citizens were asked to approve the establishment of the empire and the hereditary principle. The vote was organized by local authorities within the tightly controlled administrative system Napoleon had built. The official results showed an overwhelming majority in favor. While the exact figures were almost certainly inflated, there is little doubt that many French people supported the move. After years of upheaval, they had seen Napoleon bring order, win victories, and reconcile with the Church. The prospect of a stable imperial government built on the foundations of the revolution was acceptable, even reassuring to large segments of society. Opposition existed, of course. Some old revolutionaries were dismayed, they seeing in the coronation the final abandonment of republican simplicity and the embrace of monarchy under another name. For royalists loyal to the Bourbons, the empire was an illegitimate usurpation, a new form of tyranny born from rebellion. Yet these groups were, for the time being, outnumbered or intimidated. The machinery of the state, from police to prefects, from judges to army officers, remained firmly in Napoleon's hands. All of this set the stage for the ceremony that would give visible form to the new regime, the coronation in Paris. Napoleon wanted something that would impress both the French public and the courts of Europe, but also carry a message about the source of his authority. He invited Pope Pius VII to travel from Rome to attend the ceremony in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The presence of the Pope, head of the Catholic Church, would suggest continuity with traditional forms of sacred kingship. At the same time, Napoleon intended to show that his power did not depend on papal blessing. On the appointed day, the capital was filled with processions, uniforms, banners, and carefully arranged displays. Notre Dame itself was transformed, decorated with hangings, lights, and an elevated platform. The setting recalled the coronations of earlier French monarchs, but the audience was different. Revolutionary officers, officials in new uniforms, and delegates from various parts of the empire filled the space along with members of the old elites who had made their peace with the new order. The ceremony followed a complex ritual, mixing Roman Catholic liturgy with new elements created for the occasion. Pope Pius VII blessed the regalia and performed prayers. At the key moment, however, Napoleon made a gesture that resonated far beyond the cathedral walls. Instead of kneeling to have the crown placed upon his head by the Pope, he took it himself and set it on his own head. Afterward, he crowned Josephine as empress. This act was rich in symbolism. It signaled that, while Napoleon respected the Church and used its presence to dignify his rule, he did not accept that his authority came from any spiritual power above the nation. His legitimacy, he insisted, flowed from his own achievements and from the will of the French people expressed through plebiscites. In this sense, the coronation was not a simple return to the old regime, but a new kind of monarchy rooted in revolutionary ideas of sovereignty. The titles and trappings of empire soon followed. Napoleon became Emperor of the French, Josephine Empress, and members of his family and loyal servants were granted new ranks, princes, dukes, counts. An imperial household was organized with court ceremonies, uniforms, and an elaborate etiquette. Yet this new nobility differed from the old one in important ways. It was not based on ancient lineage, but on service to the state. Generals, ministers, and administrators who had proved themselves in war or government were rewarded with honors and titles, reinforcing the idea that merit and loyalty to the regime were the true paths to prominence. At the same time, many of the institutions created under the consulate continued to function much as before. The administrative divisions, the prefects, the legal code, the Bank of France, and the lycées did not disappear with the proclamation of the empire. Instead, they became the inner framework of a regime that was now openly dynastic. In this sense, the empire was less a sharp break than a new layer added on top of an already well-established system. The transformation also had a diplomatic dimension. European courts watched the coronation with a mix of alarm, curiosity, and reluctant pragmatism. Some, such as the Habsburgs in Vienna and the Hohenzollerns in Berlin, refused at first to recognize the new title, seeing in it a challenge to the traditional hierarchy of rulers. Others, including certain smaller states influenced or controlled by France, adapted more quickly. Over time, even the greatest powers would accept, at least formally, that Napoleon was now an emperor among emperors. Within France, the imperial regime sought to bind different social groups to its project. Former nobles who had returned from exile were given positions, or at least tolerated, if they accepted the new order. Middle-class professionals and businessmen enjoyed stability and opportunities in administration, trade, and industry. Peasants kept the land they had bought during the Revolution and valued the protection of the Napoleonic Code. Soldiers, countless numbers of them veterans of years of war, took pride in serving an emperor who had once been a fellow officer and who shared their language of honor and glory. When Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, the message to Europe was unmistakable. Revolutionary France had hardened into a powerful, centralized empire. For a brief moment, the Peace of Amiens had paused the long conflict between France and Britain, but that peace was fragile. As Napoleon expanded French influence on land and tightened control over neighboring territories, Britain watched with growing alarm from across the Channel. Before long, the uneasy calm collapsed, and Europe moved toward another great clash. The breakdown of peace came from both sides. Britain feared that a dominant France would control the continent's ports and markets, threatening British trade and security. Napoleon, for his part, resented British support for anti-French movements, British dominance at sea, and British refusal to accept French expansion in Europe. When war resumed, it quickly became clear that Britain would focus on its navy and on financing coalitions of continental powers, while Napoleon would rely on his armies to crush those coalitions on land. In London, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger worked hard to assemble a new alliance against France. He succeeded in bringing together Austria, Russia, and several smaller states in what became known as the Third Coalition. The goal was to contain and, if possible, roll back French power in Central Europe and Italy. The coalition hoped that a combined effort would overwhelm Napoleon by sheer weight of numbers and by hitting France from multiple directions at once. Napoleon responded with characteristic energy. His strategy rested on the Grande Armée, a large, well-organized force composed of corps that could march separately and concentrate rapidly when needed. This flexible structure allowed him to move his troops with speed and precision. At first, Britain expected that Napoleon might again attempt an invasion across the Channel. French forces gathered along the northern coast, and flat-bottomed boats were prepared. But once it became clear that the British Navy would not lose control of the sea, Napoleon shifted his attention eastward. The Channel Army became the instrument for a campaign deep into the heart of Europe. Before his land campaign unfurled, however, a decisive naval event reshaped the balance at sea. The French and Spanish fleets, attempting to challenge British dominance, met Admiral Horatio Nelson off the coast of Spain near Cape Trafalgar. In a bold and unconventional attack, Nelson broke the enemy line, engaged at close quarters, and shattered the combined fleet. He was killed in the battle, but his victory ensured that Britain would retain naval supremacy for the rest of the war. For Napoleon, Trafalgar meant that any hope of directly invading Britain had vanished. From then on, he would seek to defeat Britain indirectly, by controlling the continent and trying to close its ports to British trade. On land, events unfolded very differently. Napoleon led the Grande Armée across the Rhine and moved with remarkable speed into the German states allied with Austria. The Austrian commander, General Mack, had concentrated his troops around the fortress town of Ulm, expecting a more traditional French advance. Instead, Napoleon executed a wide flanking maneuver, crossing rivers and marching through difficult terrain to encircle the Austrian forces. The Ulm campaign showed his mastery of operational movement. Without a single massive battle, he forced Mack to surrender with a large part of the Austrian army trapped and demoralized. This capitulation opened the road to Vienna. French troops entered the Austrian capital, seizing supplies and further weakening Habsburg prestige. However, the war was not over. Russian forces under Tsar Alexander I and Austrian forces under Emperor Francis still had armies in the field. They gathered in the region of Moravia, hoping to combine their forces and catch Napoleon at a disadvantage. The two sides finally met near the small town of Austerlitz in a landscape of gentle hills and ponds. Napoleon carefully studied the terrain and the psychology of his opponents. He deliberately appeared weaker on one flank, encouraging the coalition armies to attack there and extend their line. Meanwhile, he kept his own reserves ready to strike at the center. On the morning of the battle, as mist drifted over the fields, the Allied commanders sent large forces against the French right, believing they could roll up Napoleon's line. This was exactly what he had hoped for. As the coalition troops moved forward and stretched their formations, Napoleon launched a powerful attack against their center, seizing the crucial Pratzen Heights. From this commanding position, French forces were able to split the Allied army in two. Fierce fighting raged across the battlefield, with some troops driven into the frozen ponds below. By the end of the day, the coalition army was shattered. Austerlitz became known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, pitting Napoleon against Tsar Alexander and Emperor Francis, and it revealed his genius at exploiting enemy expectations and terrain. The consequences of Austerlitz were enormous. Austria, having suffered yet another defeat and facing French troops lodged deep in its territory, sued for peace. The resulting Treaty of Pressburg confirmed French control over much of Italy, redistributed territories in Germany, and imposed heavy indemnities on the Habsburgs. Austria's influence in Central Europe shrank, while Napoleon's grew even larger. With Austria briefly subdued, attention shifted toward Prussia. The Prussian kingdom, ruled by King Frederick William III, had remained neutral during the early stages of the Third Coalition. However, the rise of French power in Germany and Napoleon's creation of new client states alarmed Berlin. Tensions grew as French troops moved through territories Prussia considered its sphere of influence. Under pressure from patriotic circles and from a sense of wounded pride, Prussia eventually chose war. This new conflict, sometimes called the War of the Fourth Coalition, flowed directly from the earlier victories and reordering of power. Napoleon again moved rapidly. In a series of marches and engagements, he confronted the Prussian forces at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, fought on the same day within marching distance of each other. The French inflicted crushing defeats. The once admired Prussian army, still shaped by the traditions of Frederick the Great, collapsed in a matter of weeks. French troops entered Berlin, seized fortresses, and pursued the remnants of Prussian forces as they retreated toward the east. Russia, still allied with Prussia, remained in the field. The conflict now shifted into Poland and East Prussia, where harsh winter conditions and long supply lines tested both armies. Several bloody battles followed. At Eylau, fighting in snow and blizzard conditions produced heavy losses on both sides and no clear decision. This grim encounter showed that even Napoleon's armies could be slowed and bled when weather, terrain, and determined resistance combined against them. However, the campaign did not end there. Later, at Friedland, French forces managed to concentrate against the main Russian army and break it with a powerful attack. By this time, both sides were weary. Russia had suffered major losses, and even Napoleon's troops were stretched by years of continuous campaigning. Prussia lay defeated and occupied. Austria, for the moment, remained neutralized. The way opened for negotiations between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander. Their meeting took place in dramatic fashion on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River near the town of Tilsit. The two emperors met face to face, embraced for the sake of public display, and began to carve out a new order for Europe. The agreements reached at Tilsit reshaped the map once more. Prussia lost large territories, which were reorganized into new states under French influence. Among these was the Duchy of Warsaw, a revived Polish entity that gave hope to Poles after years of partition, but remained firmly under French control. Russia accepted French dominance in Western and Central Europe, while Napoleon acknowledged Russian interests further east. In effect, the two emperors divided their spheres of influence, at least on paper. In Germany, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, a league of states that replaced the old Holy Roman Empire. Many princes who joined the Confederation gained new lands or upgraded titles, but in return they became clients of France, obliged to supply troops and follow French policy. The Holy Roman Empire, already weakened, was formally dissolved. This ended a structure that had existed for many centuries and symbolized the passing of the old medieval order. In its place, a looser but more modern collection of states emerged, many of them reshaped according to Napoleonic principles of administration and law. Across the continent, the signs of French dominance were visible. From the Atlantic coast to the borders of Russia, French troops were stationed. French advisors whispered in the ears of rulers, and the Napoleonic Code spread into new territories. Italy was reorganized into kingdoms and republics under Napoleon's family members and close allies. In the German lands, small states were mediatized or absorbed into larger units, simplifying the political map. The Habsburg monarchy had been humiliated, Prussia humbled, and Russia temporarily reconciled. Yet beneath this apparent mastery, tensions simmered. The reordering of borders often ignored local identities and traditions. Conquered and dependent states resented heavy contributions, the presence of foreign troops, and the demands for soldiers. The very efficiency of Napoleonic administration made taxation and conscription more effective, which in turn increased the burden on populations. In Prussia, reformers began quietly rebuilding their army and state, learning from their defeat. In Austria, resentment smoldered beneath the surface. In Russia, acceptance of Napoleon had clear limits, and many aristocrats distrusted the alliance. By the middle years of Napoleon's rule, French armies had shattered coalitions, humbled old monarchies, and redrawn the map of Central Europe. On land, his power seemed unmatched. But one enemy remained beyond his reach: Britain. Protected by its navy and by the Channel, Britain continued to finance resistance and to dominate global trade. After Trafalgar had closed the door on any realistic invasion across the sea, Napoleon looked for another way to bring his rival to its knees. The answer he settled on was not a battle, but a blockade, the vast experiment known as the Continental System. In simple terms, the Continental System was an attempt to wage economic war. If Napoleon could not defeat Britain at sea, he would try to cut Britain off from its customers and suppliers on the European mainland. The plan was to close all ports under French control or French influence to British ships and British goods. Without access to continental markets, Napoleon believed, British industry and commerce would falter. Factories would close, workers would be thrown out of employment, and pressure on the British government would rise until it was forced to seek peace on French terms. To put this strategy into action, Napoleon relied on something he had already built: the network of client states, allies, and occupied territories stretching from Italy to the North Sea and from the Pyrenees to the Vistula. Through a series of decrees issued from his new court, he ordered that British goods be excluded from all these regions. Neutral ships that traded with Britain risked being seized if they entered continental ports. Local rulers, many of whom owed their thrones or positions to Napoleon, were expected to cooperate. In theory, the entire European coastline, from the Baltic down to the Straits of Gibraltar, would form a single barrier against British trade. To understand why many continental rulers accepted this system, at least at first, we have to remember the balance of power at the time. Austria had recently been defeated and humbled. Prussia was occupied and partly dismembered. Russia, after Tilsit, had agreed to a temporary understanding with France. In Germany and Italy, numerous states had been reshaped and placed under the control of Napoleonic allies or family members. Refusal to cooperate with the Continental System could invite French occupation or the loss of territory. For many rulers, compliance seemed the lesser evil. Napoleon also believed that the blockade would help his own empire. If British goods disappeared from continental markets, French manufacturers and merchants, along with those in client states, could step in to fill the gap. Industries in textiles, iron, and other goods would grow behind the protective wall of the blockade. The empire would become more economically self-sufficient, less dependent on overseas trade, and more firmly under his control. However, the Continental System demanded an extraordinary level of discipline and coordination across a very diverse continent. It required customs inspectors, soldiers, and officials to monitor thousands of miles of coastline and borders. It required merchants and consumers to accept shortages and higher prices. It demanded that governments in port cities give up lucrative trading connections that had existed for generations. In reality, these demands ran against powerful interests and everyday habits. Smuggling appeared almost immediately. In the ports of the North Sea and the Baltic, and along the rugged coasts of Spain and Italy, merchants and sailors found ways to evade the regulations. Ships reflagged themselves as neutral to disguise their origins. Goods were transshipped through supposedly neutral countries, relabeled, and then quietly carried into continental markets. Local officials, often poorly paid, could be bribed to turn a blind eye. For many coastal communities, smuggling became a way of survival, not merely a criminal enterprise. The British government also reacted with its own measures. If the French decrees tried to close the continent to Britain, the British orders in council tried to block neutral ships from trading with French-controlled ports unless they first passed through British inspection. The result was a spiral of restrictions and counter-restrictions that entangled not only France and Britain, but also neutral powers like the United States. The wider Atlantic world felt the shock of this European economic war, with disruptions to shipping, seizures of vessels, and rising tensions that would eventually contribute to conflicts elsewhere. Within the empire, the economic impact of the Continental System was uneven. Some French and continental industries did benefit from reduced British competition. Certain manufacturers gained new markets, and some regions saw growth in production. But other areas, especially those dependent on overseas trade or on imported raw materials, suffered greatly. Cities that had thrived on re-exporting colonial goods found their docks quieter and their warehouses emptier. Luxury items such as sugar, coffee, and some textiles became scarce or expensive, angering both elites and ordinary consumers. These strains were particularly acute in regions where loyalty to Napoleon was already limited. In the German states along the north, in parts of Italy, and especially in the Iberian Peninsula, resentment grew. People saw French officials and soldiers enforcing the blockade while demanding taxes and conscripts. They did not always see the promised benefits. Economic hardship combined with wounded pride and religious or national feeling created a dangerous mix. As the system expanded, Napoleon's need to control more coastline pulled him into new confrontations. One of the key areas was Portugal. Historically, Portugal had strong commercial ties with Britain. Its ports, especially Lisbon, were major gateways for British trade with the continent. So long as Portugal remained open to British shipping, the Continental System had a gaping hole. Napoleon therefore demanded that the Portuguese government break off relations with Britain and join the blockade fully. When Portugal hesitated and tried to balance between the two powers, Napoleon lost patience. He decided to use force to close Portuguese ports and compel obedience. French troops marched into the Iberian Peninsula, moving through Spain with the agreement of the Spanish Bourbon monarchy. At first, this movement was presented as a joint operation to pressure Portugal. But once French forces were on Spanish soil in significant numbers, the balance of power within Spain itself began to shift. Spain was formerly an ally of France, ruled by a weak king, Charles IV, and heavily influenced by his minister Godoy. The court was divided, unpopular, and widely regarded as corrupt. Napoleon saw an opportunity not only to enforce the Continental System, but also to remake the Spanish throne in his own image. Through a mix of pressure and manipulation, he lured the Spanish royal family to Bayonne, on the French side of the border, and induced them to abdicate. He then placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. This act went far beyond economic policy. It showed that Napoleon was willing to depose long-established dynasties and replace them with his own relatives whenever it suited his plans. In some parts of Europe, such as certain Italian and German states, such changes had been tolerated or even welcomed by elites hoping for reform and modernization. In Spain, the reaction was very different. The Spanish people, already resentful of French troops on their soil, reacted with fury to the removal of their native king and the imposition of a foreign ruler. In Madrid, a popular uprising broke out, leading to a brutal repression by French forces. The famous painting by Francisco Goya, showing executions of Spanish civilians, captures the mood of that moment, a mixture of defiance, fear, and violence. Across Spain, local juntas began to form, claiming to represent legitimate authority in the name of the absent king and the nation. What had begun as an effort to enforce the Continental System now grew into a widespread war of resistance. Spanish guerrilla fighters attacked French columns, supply lines, and outposts. They knew the local terrain, enjoyed support from the population, and could vanish into the countryside after striking. For the French, who were used to decisive battles on open fields, this type of warfare was frustrating and costly. It tied down large numbers of troops, drained resources, and undermined the image of French invincibility. Britain seized the opportunity. By landing troops in Portugal and supporting Spanish resistance, the British government opened a new land front where Napoleon's enemies could contest his rule. Under commanders such as Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, British and Portuguese forces, allied with Spanish fighters, began a long struggle on the peninsula. This conflict would become known as the Peninsula War, and it would last for many years. It was, in many ways, the direct outcome of Napoleon's decision to enforce the Continental System by occupying and reshaping the Iberian Peninsula. The pressures of the blockade and the wars needed to uphold it also affected Napoleon's relations with Russia. Although the Tsar had agreed at Tilsit to cooperate with the Continental System, Russian interests were not identical to those of France. Russian nobles and merchants depended on exports of grain and raw materials. Cutting off trade with Britain or with markets reached through British shipping hurt the Russian economy. Smuggling through the Baltic and other routes became widespread, sometimes with the quiet support of local officials. As time passed, Tsar Alexander and many in his court grew increasingly unhappy with the burdens of the alliance with Napoleon. They saw French influence expanding into Central Europe and the Balkans, while Russia was expected to bear the costs of the blockade. They also resented Napoleon's creation of new states, such as the Duchy of Warsaw, which seemed to threaten Russian interests in Poland. The Continental System, meant to cement French dominance, thus contributed to rising tension between the two emperors. Within France itself, the system had complex effects. While some industries enjoyed protection, others suffered from the lack of imported materials and the disruption of trade. Consumers felt the pinch of higher prices and reduced variety. Black markets flourished, undermining respect for the law. Even loyal officials sometimes looked the other way when smugglers could provide goods that the population demanded. The gap between the grand imperial project announced in Paris and the reality on the ground widened. From a broader perspective, the Continental System illustrated a central contradiction of Napoleon's empire. His strength lay in his ability to move armies quickly, win battles, and impose treaties. But an economic blockade required something different: sustained cooperation from many governments and societies, long-term self-denial, and the suppression of countless local interests and habits. It demanded a level of control that even a powerful conqueror could not fully achieve, especially across such a large and varied continent. By the time Napoleon turned his attention fully to the Iberian Peninsula, his empire already stretched across much of continental Europe. Yet the Spanish and Portuguese campaign would prove different from his earlier wars. It would not be decided by a single great battle or a swift diplomatic settlement. Instead, it would become a long, grinding struggle that drained French strength, eroded prestige, and opened a new kind of warfare that Napoleon could never fully master. The origins of this conflict lay in the logic of the Continental System. Portugal's historic trade with Britain and its Atlantic ports made it a stubborn weak point in the blockade. French troops had already entered the peninsula, moving through Spain with the agreement of the Spanish court, supposedly to pressure Portugal into compliance. Once those troops were in place, Napoleon pushed further, reshaping the Spanish monarchy and installing his brother Joseph on the throne. That act, combined with heavy-handed French behavior, ignited popular resistance. When Spanish uprisings began, they were not carefully planned national revolts from the top. They often started as local explosions of anger, driven by outrage at foreign occupation, fear for the Catholic faith, and loyalty to the old dynasty. Townspeople attacked isolated garrisons, priests preached resistance from pulpits, and peasants took up whatever weapons they could find. The revolt in Madrid and its brutal suppression became a symbol, but similar scenes echoed across the country. News of atrocities, whether real or exaggerated, spread quickly and hardened attitudes on both sides. French commanders were initially confident that they could crush this unrest as they had put down revolts elsewhere. They sent columns into the countryside, executed suspected rebels, and tried to seize control of provincial capitals. They underestimated the depth of feeling among ordinary Spaniards and the difficulty of fighting in such rugged terrain against enemies who refused to stand in open battle. What emerged was a type of war that later generations would call guerrilla warfare, from the Spanish word for little war. These guerrilla bands were not formal armies. They were loose groups of fighters who knew the local hills, forests, and passes. They struck at French convoys, ambushed patrols, and cut communications between garrisons. After attacking, they melted away into villages or mountains, supported by family networks and sympathetic communities. The French, who relied on long supply lines and centralized command, struggled to deal with an enemy that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The guerrilla war had both military and psychological effects. Militarily, it forced the French to divert large numbers of troops to escort duties and punitive expeditions. Units that might have been used in the main European theaters were tied down, marching endlessly from one small town to another, hunting enemies they could rarely bring to decisive battle. Psychologically, the constant fear of ambush, the hostility of the population, and the impossibility of distinguishing fighters from civilians wore down French morale. While this little war raged in the countryside, a more conventional struggle unfolded on the larger stage. The Spanish resistance received crucial support from Britain, which saw in the Iberian Revolt a chance to open a land front against Napoleon. British forces landed in Portugal and began organizing a defense, working closely with Portuguese troops and institutions. Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, emerged as the key British commander in this theater. Wellesley's approach to war differed in important ways from some of Napoleon's continental opponents. He understood the importance of logistics, the need to secure lines of supply, and the value of defensive positions. Rather than seeking reckless glory, he aimed to conserve his forces and strike when conditions were favorable. Working with Portuguese allies, he trained local troops, strengthened fortifications, and used the difficult terrain to advantage. The early campaigns saw both sides testing each other. French marshals, confident in their experience, launched offensives to drive the British into the sea and restore full control over Portugal and Spain. They won some tactical victories, but they also faced setbacks. Wellesley carefully chose battlefields that limited French superiority in numbers and cavalry, and when necessary, he withdrew in good order rather than risk destruction. At certain moments, Portuguese and Spanish forces performed poorly or broke under pressure, but over time they improved, especially when supported by British officers and training. One of the major turning points came when Wellesley constructed a formidable series of defensive lines north of Lisbon, known as the Lines of Torres Vedras. These fortifications, combined with scorched earth tactics in front of them, created a deep defensive system that French forces could not easily breach. When a large French army advanced into Portugal, expecting to defeat the Allies and seize the capital, it found itself blocked by these lines and short of supplies. Unable to force a breakthrough and harassed by guerrilla attacks, the French eventually had to retreat, weakened and demoralized. The war in Spain itself also evolved. At first, French armies under skilled marshals won several set-piece battles against regular Spanish forces, capturing major cities and pressing deep into the country. However, every time they advanced, they left behind a trail of resentment and a landscape filled with small but deadly enemies. Garrisons found themselves isolated, roads were dangerous, and the French presence relied increasingly on force rather than any genuine acceptance. As British and Portuguese forces grew stronger, they began to operate more aggressively on Spanish soil. Wellington coordinated with certain Spanish regular units and with local leaders. The Allied armies gradually advanced, winning key engagements that began to push the French back. The combination of a conventional Allied army in the west and center and guerrilla bands across the countryside turned the peninsula into a hostile environment for Napoleon's troops. From the perspective of the French High Command, the Peninsular War became a frustrating contradiction. On paper, they still held many cities, including Madrid at various points, and they could point to numerous tactical successes. In practice, their control seldom extended far beyond the range of their cannons. As soon as a column marched away from a region, the guerrillas reappeared. The cost of holding territory far exceeded the benefits in terms of resources or strategic position. The human cost was also enormous. French soldiers suffered not only from combat, but from disease, poor supplies, and the constant strain of an unforgiving campaign. Spanish civilians endured reprisals, looting, and the destruction that followed in the wake of every clash. The war hardened attitudes on all sides, producing a legacy of bitterness that would survive long after the conflict itself ended. Artists and writers who lived through those years later portrayed scenes of executions, massacres, and suffering that captured the darker side of Napoleonic conquest. Politically, the war in Spain and Portugal helped to awaken and strengthen a sense of national identity. For many Spaniards, resistance to foreign occupation and defense of Catholicism fused into a broader idea of defending the Spanish nation. In the absence of a functioning royal court, local juntas claimed to rule in the name of the people and of the legitimate but absent monarch. In Portugal, cooperation between British forces and Portuguese authorities helped preserve the independence of the kingdom and its institutions, even as the royal family spent years in exile in Brazil. The constitutional developments in Spain during this period were also significant. Spanish patriots and intellectuals gathered in Cadiz, a port city that remained free of French control, and convened a Cortes, or National Assembly. There they debated and eventually drafted a liberal constitution that sought to balance monarchy with representation and to define the rights of citizens. Although this document had a complicated and often short-lived history after the war, its creation showed how resistance to Napoleon could stimulate not just military, but also political transformation. From Napoleon's point of view, the Iberian campaign had started as a calculated move within his larger strategy. He wanted to close the last major gap in the Continental System, secure control over the western edge of Europe, and place another member of his family on a throne. Instead, he found himself trapped in a prolonged struggle that consumed men and money on an astonishing scale. The term Spanish ulcer became a common way to describe how this war sapped the vitality of his empire. As the years passed, the number of French troops committed to the peninsula grew, even while Napoleon needed forces elsewhere. He spent time personally in Spain during the early stages, winning some battles and trying to impose order, but he could not remain there indefinitely. The main decisions of European strategy still had to be taken from Paris and from the eastern fronts. He left the ongoing war in the hands of his marshals, many of whom were capable, but none of whom possessed his full authority or strategic vision. This division of responsibilities led to further problems. Rivalries among French commanders, inconsistent instructions, and the sheer difficulty of communication in such a vast and hostile territory all weakened the French effort. Wellington, by contrast, retained overall command of the Allied forces in the peninsula and maintained a coherent strategy over time. As British logistics improved, and as more Portuguese and Spanish units were trained and equipped, the Allies were able steadily to expand their operations. By the early 18-teens, the momentum had clearly shifted. Allied victories and continued guerrilla pressure forced the French to abandon more and more territory. Major fortresses that had once symbolized French authority fell after long sieges. The line of French control retreated toward the Pyrenees. Each step back signaled not only a loss of ground, but also a loss of prestige. The myth of Napoleonic invincibility, already strained by the difficulties of economic warfare, now seemed increasingly fragile. The broader impact of the Peninsular War reached far beyond Spain and Portugal. In other parts of Europe, opponents of Napoleon watched the steady erosion of French power in the West and drew encouragement. They saw that an imperial army could be resisted, not only by regular forces, but also by popular movements. They noted how the combination of local determination and foreign support, especially from Britain, could gradually force even a mighty occupier to retreat. By the second decade of the 19th century, Napoleon's empire seemed to dominate the European continent. Yet beneath the surface, his system was beginning to crack. Nowhere was this more evident than in his relationship with Russia. Only a few years earlier, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I had met on a raft at Tilsit and agreed to cooperate, at least outwardly, but that partnership was never built on deep trust. It was a temporary arrangement between two ambitious rulers, each with a different vision for Europe. Tension grew as the Continental System spread. The blockade against British trade harmed Russia in ways that it did not harm France. Russian nobles depended heavily on exporting grain, timber, and raw materials. When ports were closed and British goods were banned, Russian merchants suffered. Smuggling became common, especially around the Baltic, and many Russian officials quietly tolerated it. For them, strict obedience to the Continental System made little sense when it damaged their own economy. At the same time, Napoleon's reorganization of Central Europe alarmed the Russian court. The creation of the Duchy of Warsaw, a new Polish state under French influence, stirred fears in St. Petersburg. Polish patriots looked to Napoleon with hope, seeing a chance to undo the partitions that had destroyed their country. For Tsar Alexander, any revival of Polish power along his western borders threatened Russian security. As French influence in Poland and parts of Germany grew, Russian suspicion deepened. Personal factors also played a role. Napoleon had once imagined strengthening his link to Russia through marriage. After divorcing Josephine, he sought a union with a Russian Grand Duchess, but negotiations failed. Instead, he married Marie-Louise of Austria. This choice not only tied him to the Habsburgs, but also signaled to Russia that France could shift its alliances. Over time, the warmth of Tilsit cooled into rivalry and mistrust. By the early 18-teens, Russia began to loosen its commitment to the Continental System. Tariffs were adjusted, controls relaxed, and British goods found their way into Russian markets in increasing quantities. For Napoleon, this was more than an economic problem. It was a challenge to his authority and a threat to the whole strategy of isolating Britain. If a great power like Russia openly ignored the blockade, others would follow. The Continental System, already leaking in the Iberian Peninsula and in the north, risked collapsing altogether. Napoleon decided that only a decisive show of force could restore his dominance. He convinced himself that Tsar Alexander would yield if confronted with overwhelming military pressure. The goal, at least in his own mind, was not necessarily to conquer and hold all of Russia, but to inflict a defeat so crushing that the Tsar would have no choice but to return to the French alliance and fully enforce the blockade. It was a plan built on the logic of previous campaigns, where rapid marches and big battles had yielded treaties and territorial gains. But Russia was not Italy, nor Austria, nor Prussia. The sheer scale of its land and the harshness of its climate made it a very different opponent. To carry out his design, Napoleon assembled what became known as the Grande Armée of the Russian campaign, one of the largest forces Europe had ever seen up to that point. It was not purely French. It included troops from many parts of the empire and its allies, Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, and others, each marching under their own banners, but all subordinated to French command. This multinational army looked impressive on parade, but its diversity added complexity to supply, communication, and cohesion. In the summer of 1812, the army crossed the river Niemen, which marked the border. Napoleon reportedly declared that the Second Polish War had begun, framing the invasion as an effort to free Poland from Russian domination. But whatever name he gave it, the reality was that he was leading hundreds of thousands of men into a vast and unfamiliar territory, relying on speed and decisive battle as he had so often before. Russian strategy, however, did not follow the script Napoleon expected. Instead of standing and fighting near the frontier, Russian generals, including Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, fell back, trading space for time. They burned supplies and crops as they retreated, leaving only devastated countryside for the invaders. For the Grande Armée, this meant that the further it advanced, the longer its supply lines grew and the scarcer local resources became. Heat, dust, disease, and hunger began to take their toll even before a major battle was fought. As the French advanced deeper, frustration grew within Napoleon's camp. Many officers wished for a single, clear engagement that would finally bring the Russians to terms. The Tsar and his advisors, however, understood that simply offering such a battle under unfavorable conditions could lead to disaster. They chose instead to stretch the campaign, letting distance, weather, and attrition weaken their enemy. Still, public opinion in Russia demanded some stand be made. The pressure on the Russian high command to defend Moscow was enormous. The long-anticipated major battle came near the village of Borodino, west of Moscow. The Russians prepared field fortifications, including redoubts and earthworks, and massed their troops to block the French advance. Napoleon brought his army forward, ready to stake everything on this clash. The fighting at Borodino was savage and intense. Artillery pounded the opposing lines, cavalry charges swept across the fields, and infantry assaults struggled to seize and hold key positions. By the end of the day, the Russian army had been driven back, and the French could claim a tactical victory. They held the field and had forced the Russians to retreat toward Moscow. Yet the cost was immense. Casualties on both sides were staggering. Crucially, the Russian army was not destroyed. It remained a coherent fighting force, wounded but alive, capable of regrouping further east. Napoleon had won a battle, but not the decisive annihilation he had been hoping for. When the French army reached Moscow, they found a city under eerie conditions. Much of the population had fled. Soon after the French entered, fires broke out across the city. Whether started on official orders or by local acts of defiance, the blazes spread rapidly through the largely wooden buildings. Moscow burned for days. Instead of a warm, well-stocked winter base and a powerful bargaining chip, Napoleon faced a charred ruin with limited supplies and no clear path to negotiation. Napoleon waited in Moscow, expecting Tsar Alexander to send envoys and seek peace. None came. The Tsar had made up his mind not to bargain while enemy troops remained on Russian soil. He believed that only continued resistance, combined with the arrival of winter, would break the French invasion. Time, which had often been Napoleon's ally in earlier campaigns, now turned against him. As the weeks passed, conditions in Moscow worsened. Food grew scarce, discipline frayed. News from the countryside spoke of Russian forces regrouping and of Cossack raids on French supply lines. Napoleon faced a terrible choice: remain in Moscow and risk being cut off, or withdraw along the same devastated route his army had used to advance, now stripped even further of resources. Eventually, he chose to retreat. The decision came late in the season, when autumn was already giving way to the first signs of winter. The departure from Moscow marked the beginning of one of the most tragic marches in military history. The Grande Armée, already weakened by months of hardship, began to move westward along ruined roads under increasingly hostile skies. At first, the weather was cold but manageable. Then the full force of the Russian winter set in. Temperatures plunged. Snow and ice turned rivers and roads into treacherous obstacles. Soldiers whose clothing and footwear had not been designed for such conditions suffered horribly. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives. Horses, essential for transport, cavalry, and artillery, died in great numbers, leaving guns and wagons stranded. Starvation became a daily reality. Men ate what they could find: horse meat, leather, even scraps from the dead. All the while, Russian forces harassed the retreating column. Cossacks and light troops struck at stragglers, rear guards, and supply wagons. Larger Russian formations maneuvered to block or damage French movements. There were additional battles, such as the grueling crossing of the Berezina River, where Napoleon's engineers managed to build bridges under fire to rescue part of the army. Even that success, however, could not hide the overall catastrophe. The Grande Armée that crossed back into friendly territories was a shadow of the force that had marched into Russia. Entire units had ceased to exist as coherent formations. The loss of men, horses, equipment, and prestige was immense. News of the disaster spread quickly across Europe. Enemies who had once feared Napoleon began to see that his power was not invincible. Allies who had obeyed him reluctantly now sensed that his grip was weakening. The Russian campaign damaged Napoleon in several interconnected ways. Militarily, it destroyed a large portion of his veteran troops, the core of his war machine. Politically, it undermined the aura of success that had surrounded him for so long. The image of the emperor as a man who always found a way to win, who bent circumstances to his will, no longer matched reality. Diplomatically, it encouraged other powers to reconsider their positions. Prussia, Austria, and others who had submitted to French supremacy now saw an opportunity to regain independence and perhaps revenge. When Napoleon returned from the Russian campaign, he brought back not a victorious army, but the fragments of a shattered force. The myth of the emperor who always triumphed was broken. Across Europe, rulers and peoples understood that this was their moment. If they acted together, they might finally push back the French Empire that had dominated the continent for so many years. Out of this realization emerged the Sixth Coalition, a broad alliance determined not just to restrain Napoleon, but to overthrow his system altogether. Russia moved first. Having driven the invaders from its territory, the Russian army did not simply stop at the frontier. Tsar Alexander I, buoyed by the defense of his country and the moral force of victory, pushed his armies westward. He now saw himself not only as defender of Russia, but as liberator of Europe. Russian troops advanced into the lands that Napoleon had once controlled or influenced, calling on Germans and others to rise against French domination. Prussia, humbled and partially occupied since its defeat in earlier wars, now faced a critical choice. Many Prussian officers and reformers had spent years rebuilding their state in secret, learning from their defeat and reorganizing their army. The disaster that had befallen Napoleon in Russia convinced them that the time to act had come. Despite hesitation at the royal court, a wave of patriotic feeling swept through Prussian society. King Frederick William III eventually joined Russia, issuing a call to arms that presented the struggle as a war of liberation, not just a diplomatic move. Austria watched carefully. The Habsburg monarchy had been defeated more than once by Napoleon and had seen its territories reduced. Yet it was also bound to him by family ties through his marriage to Marie-Louise. At first, Austria tried to play a mediating role, hoping to secure a compromise that would preserve some balance of power. But as the conflict widened and as French weakness became clearer, Austrian leaders, especially the influential statesman Metternich, concluded that only firm opposition could restore stability. In time, Austria too would join the coalition. Napoleon, for his part, refused to accept that his fortunes had changed permanently. One of his greatest strengths had always been his ability to recover quickly from setbacks. Drawing on the administrative machinery he had built in France, he ordered fresh levies of conscripts, young men who became known as the Marie Louises, after the empress who signed the decrees. They were brave but inexperienced, lacking the training and seasoning of the veterans lost in Russia. Still, they provided Napoleon with the raw numbers he needed to field new armies in Central Europe. The campaign that followed shifted mainly to Germany. There, the French emperor sought to reassert his control over the Confederation of the Rhine and to prevent the coalition armies from combining their strength. He won several battles in the early months, demonstrating that his tactical skill had not vanished. At places such as Lutzen and Bautzen, French forces managed to push back coalition troops, though often at significant cost. These victories, however, were not decisive. They failed to destroy enemy armies or to break the will of the coalition leaders. An armistice was arranged for a time, during which diplomats tried to find a negotiated settlement. Metternich met Napoleon in person, urging him to accept limitations on his empire in exchange for peace. The Austrian statesman proposed that France withdraw from some conquered territories and return to more natural borders, keeping its status as a great power but giving up the dream of total continental dominance. Napoleon listened, but his instinct pushed him to hold on to as much as possible. He feared that any major concession would encourage further demands and undermine his authority at home. The chance for a compromise slipped away. Once the armistice ended, the coalition adopted a new strategy. Instead of seeking a single climactic battle against Napoleon, they agreed on the principle of the central position in reverse. Whenever possible, they would avoid engaging his main force head-on while using their numerical superiority to threaten his flanks and stretch his resources. This was a deliberate effort to counter the methods that had brought him so many victories in previous years. The struggle reached its climax around the city of Leipzig in Saxony. There, over several days of fierce fighting, armies from many nations clashed in what later came to be called the Battle of the Nations. Napoleon stood at the center of a huge engagement, commanding French, Italian, Polish, and other units, while facing a coalition that included Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Swedes, and smaller German contingents. For the first time, he faced a firmly united and numerically superior alliance determined to fight through to a conclusion. On the battlefield, Napoleon showed flashes of his old skill, shifting corps and mounting counterattacks. Yet the odds were against him. As the days wore on, the coalition forces pressed in from multiple directions. Some of Napoleon's German allies, sensing that his star was fading, went over to the enemy in the midst of the battle, turning their guns against their former commander. This open defection struck a hard blow at French morale and contributed to the unraveling of the French position. Eventually, Napoleon ordered a retreat. Even this withdrawal turned into a disaster when a bridge over the Elster River was blown up too soon, leaving thousands of French troops stranded and forcing some to try to swim to safety. The losses at Leipzig were heavy, not only in men and material, but in prestige. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Napoleon since the Italian campaigns and Austerlitz was gone. The Battle of the Nations confirmed that a determined coalition, willing to coordinate and to accept casualties, could defeat him in open conflict. After Leipzig, the strategic situation deteriorated rapidly for France. The Confederation of the Rhine collapsed as German states abandoned Napoleon and sought to join the coalition, or at least free themselves from French control. In the Low Countries and in parts of Italy, French authority was challenged or overturned. The tide that had once flowed outward from Paris, carrying French influence across the continent, now flowed back toward France itself. The coalition leaders faced a crucial decision. Should they stop at the Rhine and try to negotiate, or should they carry the war into French territory? Tsar Alexander, in particular, argued strongly for pressing on. He believed that as long as Napoleon remained on the throne in Paris, Europe would know no lasting peace. Prussian patriots agreed, eager to see French troops driven not only from Germany, but from all lands beyond their own borders. Austria, more cautious, feared that pushing Napoleon too far might provoke desperate resistance or unleash revolutionary forces once again. Yet in the end, the coalition agreed to advance. Napoleon, confronted with invasion, prepared to defend France. He still possessed remarkable energy and tactical genius. In the campaign that followed, often called the French Campaign, he fought a series of battles on home soil, moving rapidly along interior lines to strike at separated enemy columns. At places such as Champaubert, Montmirail, and other engagements in the plains and villages of northeastern France, he won surprising victories against larger forces, using his familiar methods of speed and concentration. These successes revived the spirits of his supporters for a moment and showed that the emperor was still a formidable commander. Yet they could not alter the fundamental imbalance. The coalition armies were simply too numerous and too determined. For every column that Napoleon defeated, others continued their advance. The enemy could afford losses that France, drained by years of war and the disaster in Russia, could no longer easily replace. Meanwhile, political pressures inside France grew stronger. War weariness spread among the population. Many families had seen sons and fathers conscripted again and again. Trade had suffered under the Continental System and the disruptions of repeated campaigns. Some members of the elite, including senators and former officials, began to consider the possibility of a change in regime. They weighed the costs of continuing to support Napoleon against the hope that a negotiated settlement might be easier with another ruler. Coalition forces, advancing through eastern France, aimed ultimately at Paris. Napoleon tried to threaten their flanks and rear, hoping to draw them away from the capital. But the Allied commanders pressed on. They understood that capturing Paris would deliver a decisive political blow. As they neared the city, negotiations began between coalition representatives and French figures who were ready to abandon the emperor. In the spring of that year, Paris fell to the coalition after a brief but fierce battle. Foreign troops entered the French capital, an event that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier when Napoleon seemed supreme. The occupation of the city shocked the French public and convinced many that the imperial regime could no longer protect the nation. In this atmosphere, members of the Senate and other institutions declared that Napoleon was deposed and called for the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in the person of Louis, brother of the executed king. Napoleon, who had been away from Paris trying to mount a counteroffensive, learned of the fall of the capital and the actions taken by the political elite. He considered marching on Paris to retake it, but the reality on the ground made such a move nearly impossible. His remaining troops were exhausted and outnumbered, and further resistance risked civil war as well as foreign occupation. Under pressure from his marshals and advisors, who believed that continued fighting would only make terms harsher, he agreed to abdicate. When Napoleon left France for the island of Elba, many people in Europe believed that his story was over. The emperor, who had once ruled from Madrid to Warsaw, now found himself confined to a small, rocky island off the Italian coast, allowed a tiny guard, a modest court, and a hollow title. Yet while he adjusted to this strange new role, the great powers of Europe gathered to rebuild the political map he had torn apart. The period between his first abdication and his dramatic return is a bridge between two worlds, the world of the French Revolution and the world of the restored monarchies. Elba was a small stage for a man who had grown used to commanding empires. Still, Napoleon did not simply sink into idleness. On the island, he behaved as if he were still a ruler, only on a reduced scale. He reorganized local administration, inspected roads and ports, and tried to improve agriculture and mining. He rode around the island on horseback, visited villages, and spoke with inhabitants. In a sense, he transformed Elba into a miniature version of his wider rule, complete with reforms, ceremonies, and constant activity. But no matter how much he worked, the limits of his situation were obvious. His income, promised by the victors, often arrived late or in reduced amounts. His tiny army and fleet were symbols rather than real instruments of power. Foreign observers and spies watched his every move, reporting back to their governments. Napoleon followed news from France and Europe as closely as he could, reading newspapers and letters, questioning visitors, and trying to judge whether the new order that had replaced him would last. In France, the Bourbon monarchy had returned with Louis XVIII on the throne. The new king faced a delicate task. He had to restore royal authority without completely rejecting all that had happened since the Revolution. Many nobles who had lived in exile for years returned, hoping to recover status, influence, or even property. Veterans of the imperial armies, on the other hand, suspected that the court looked down on them and might wish to turn back the clock to the days before the Revolution. Louis XVIII issued a charter that promised some constitutional guarantees, a parliament, legal equality, and respect for certain rights. Yet many people who had benefited from the Revolution and the empire remained uneasy. They feared that their lands, titles, or positions could be taken away. At the same time, royalists who had suffered under Napoleon resented the compromises the king made. The result was a climate of mistrust. The white flag of the Bourbons flew over Paris, but beneath it, deep divisions remained. Across Europe, the rulers who had defeated Napoleon gathered at the Congress of Vienna. Representatives of Austria, Russia, Britain, Prussia, and other states met to decide how to restore order after decades of war. The leading figure of the Congress was the Austrian foreign minister, Clemens von Metternich, a skilled diplomat who believed that peace depended on a careful balance of power and on the containment of revolutionary ideas. Alongside him stood the British Foreign Secretary, Viscount Castlereagh, and the Russian Tsar Alexander I, who saw himself as a kind of moral leader of the victorious alliance. Prussia and other powers also sent important delegates. The Congress of Vienna had several main goals. First, it wanted to redraw the map of Europe in a way that would prevent any single state from dominating the continent as France had done under Napoleon. Second, it aimed to restore legitimate dynasties, meaning families that had ruled before the Revolution, wherever possible. Third, it sought to create a system of alliances and understandings that would allow the great powers to manage future conflicts and keep revolutionary movements in check. In practice, these goals often conflicted with one another. For example, restoring traditional rulers did not always match the desire to maintain a balance of power. Questions about territory could not be solved simply by looking backward. The old Holy Roman Empire had vanished. Poland had been partitioned, revived in part as the Duchy of Warsaw, and now had to be reconsidered. The German lands were a patchwork of states of different sizes and traditions. Italy was divided among various rulers, old and new. Every change in one place affected the strategic situation in another. One of the most contentious issues was Poland and Saxony. Russia, under Tsar Alexander, wanted to turn most of the former Duchy of Warsaw into a Polish kingdom under Russian protection. Prussia, for its part, hoped to acquire large parts of Saxony as compensation. Austria and Britain worried that these moves would give Russia and Prussia too much power in Central Europe. Metternich and Castlereagh worked hard to limit the expansion of both Eastern powers, fearing that a strong Russia in Poland and a greatly enlarged Prussia in Germany would upset the fragile equilibrium they were trying to build. A compromise eventually emerged. Russia received a substantial portion of Polish territory, creating a new Polish kingdom linked to the Russian crown, though not in the fully independent form that many Poles had hoped for. Prussia gained important lands in the Rhineland and Westphalia, making it a major force in Western Germany, but had to accept a reduced share of Saxony compared to what it had originally demanded. Austria regained some of its former influence in Italy and Central Europe. The German states were grouped into a German confederation, a loose association under Austrian leadership that replaced the old Holy Roman Empire. Elsewhere, the Congress strengthened the Netherlands by joining the old Dutch Republic with what had been the Austrian Netherlands, roughly corresponding to modern Belgium. The idea was to create a strong state along the northern border of France that could help contain French power in the future. In Italy, the Habsburgs took control of Lombardy and Venetia, while other regions went to restored or reconfigured dynasties, such as the House of Savoy in Piedmont and the Bourbons in Naples. Switzerland's neutrality was formally recognized, turning it into a buffer zone in the center of the continent. Throughout these negotiations, one question remained: what to do with France itself. The Allies did not want to destroy France or break it into pieces. They knew that such a move would only sow trouble and resentment. Instead, they aimed to reintegrate France as one great power among others, limited by borders and by the presence of strong neighbors. Under Louis XVIII, France was allowed to keep many of the territorial changes that had taken place earlier in the revolutionary period, but not the conquests of the Napoleonic years. The idea was to draw a line, accept what could not realistically be turned back, and prevent new adventures. The Congress of Vienna is often remembered for its grand balls, glittering receptions, and complex diplomacy. Yet beneath the surface of formal harmony, there were sharp disagreements and rivalries. Each power pursued its own interests while claiming to act for the general good of Europe. Metternich wanted to anchor Austrian influence and to build a conservative system that would suppress revolution. Tsar Alexander dreamed of a more moral and religious order, leading to the later creation of the so-called Holy Alliance. Britain focused on maintaining its naval and commercial strength while preventing any continental hegemon from threatening its security. News of these debates reached Napoleon on Elba in fragments, but he understood enough to see that the victors were still arguing among themselves. He also watched events in France with growing interest. Reports from the mainland suggested that the Bourbon regime was not popular with large sections of the army and the public. Many officers who had served under Napoleon felt sidelined or distrustful of the new rulers. Some royalist officials treated them as potential enemies rather than as honored veterans. People who had bought land confiscated during the revolution feared that the returning nobles might try to reclaim their former estates. The king's government made efforts to balance these tensions, but missteps were frequent. The white flag of the Bourbons did not inspire the same passionate loyalty as the tricolor that many soldiers had carried across Europe. Rumors circulated that foreign troops and foreign ministers had too much influence over French affairs. Pride was wounded. For those who had identified their own dignity with the achievements of the Imperial army, the sight of occupation forces and of a cautious, older king seemed like a step backward. Napoleon gauged this mood carefully. His own position on Elba was becoming less secure as well. The payments promised by the Allies were sometimes delayed. The presence of British and other observers reminded him that he was tolerated only as long as he remained quiet. He began to feel that his personal fate would be decided elsewhere, and not necessarily in his favor. If the Congress agreed on a new settlement that removed even the small sovereignty he had been granted, he could find himself in a far more unpleasant captivity. All these factors pushed him toward a bold decision. Rather than wait passively for others to decide his future, Napoleon resolved to act. He believed that if he returned to France, he could rally the army and much of the population behind him. He counted on the unpopularity of the Bourbons, the loyalty of veteran soldiers, and his own extraordinary reputation. He told close companions that the French would choose the eagle over the lilies, meaning the imperial symbol over the royal emblem. When Napoleon stepped ashore on the southern coast of France after his escape from Elba, he carried no grand army, no treasure, and no official mandate. What he did carry was a legendary name and a sharp understanding of French politics. The restored Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII was fragile, tolerated more than loved. Many soldiers and officers felt sidelined. Civilians were divided between those who longed for stability and those who resented foreign influence and the return of exiled nobles. Into this uncertain atmosphere, Napoleon advanced like a living question. Which France did people still want? Marching north with only a small force, he made a calculated gamble. Instead of sneaking toward Paris, he moved openly, trusting that the army would remember him as their old commander. As royal troops approached to block his path near Grenoble, Napoleon walked forward alone, opened his coat, and invited them, according to later accounts, to fire if they wished to kill their emperor. Whether every word of that scene happened exactly as reported matters less than the essential truth. The royal soldiers chose not to shoot. Slowly at first, then more openly, they rallied to him. Cries of "Vive l'Empereur" replaced loyalty to the white Bourbon flag. As he advanced, his column grew. Units sent to stop him joined instead. Officers who had served under him during earlier campaigns returned to his side. By the time Napoleon neared Paris, the monarchy's military support had largely melted away. Louis XVIII, sensing that the capital was no longer safe, fled toward the northern frontier. Napoleon entered Paris to cheering crowds and took up residence once more in the Tuileries Palace. This was the beginning of the period later called the 100 Days, though in reality, it lasted a little longer than that name suggests. During this short time, Napoleon tried to achieve something extremely difficult: to restore his rule in a way that could rally France while avoiding total war with the rest of Europe. He understood that the Allied powers, gathered at Vienna, had already declared him an outlaw and would not simply accept his return as an internal French matter. To survive, he needed to convince both domestic opinion and foreign governments that his second reign would be more moderate than the first. Inside France, he moved quickly to present himself not as a dictator returning to impose old ways, but as a leader ready to accept constitutional limits. He promised to respect property obtained since the Revolution and to maintain many of the legal and administrative reforms that had become part of everyday life. He ordered preparations for a new charter that would give a greater role to representative institutions, hoping to win over liberals and moderates who had feared his previous authoritarian methods. Yet Napoleon's room for compromise was limited. Many royalists remained implacably hostile, seeing him as the man who had executed or exiled their leaders and overturned their world. Veterans and Bonapartist loyalists expected a return to glory, not a cautious, restrained monarchy. Time was short, suspicion was widespread, and the shadow of foreign invasion hung over every decision. Beyond France's borders, the news of his escape and return caused alarm and fury. The great powers at Vienna reacted with remarkable speed and unity. They declared that Napoleon had broken the settlement and that he was an enemy of peace. More importantly, they agreed to raise armies once again and to continue the war, not against France as a nation, but against Napoleon personally. Their goal was now clear: to remove him definitively and to prevent a third act of imperial expansion. Strategically, Napoleon faced a difficult map. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia all promised to mobilize large forces and converge on France from different directions. If he waited passively, they would have time to assemble overwhelming numbers and invade on several fronts. His only real chance lay in striking quickly before the coalition could fully unite, and defeating some of the Allied armies separately, as he had done in earlier years. He decided to move against the forces gathering in the Low Countries, where British troops under the Duke of Wellington and Prussian troops under Field Marshal Blücher were concentrating. If Napoleon could drive a wedge between these armies, defeat them in succession, and perhaps knock one out of the war or push it back behind a river line, he might force the coalition into negotiations. It was a plan rooted in his old strategy of attacking the joints of a coalition, not its whole mass at once. In the early summer of that year, Napoleon marched his army north into Belgium. His force was smaller than the great armies he had once led, but it still contained many experienced officers and soldiers, along with new conscripts. The emperor hoped that speed and surprise would compensate for numbers. At first, events seemed to support this hope. He struck between the British and Prussian forces, defeating the Prussians at Ligny and engaging elements of Wellington's army at Quatre Bras. Both Allied commanders were forced to adjust their positions. However, the situation did not unfold as Napoleon had ideally wished. Although Blücher's army suffered at Ligny, it was not destroyed. Instead of retreating eastward away from the British, the Prussians fell back in a way that allowed them to keep contact with Wellington. Communication between the two Allied commanders, though imperfect, remained sufficient to coordinate future movements. Wellington, for his part, chose a defensive position on a ridge near the village of Waterloo, south of Brussels, and prepared to receive Napoleon's next blow. The ground at Waterloo offered several advantages to a defensive army. A gentle slope provided some protection against artillery. Farmhouses and walled enclosures, such as Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, could be turned into strongpoints. The soil, when dry, was workable, but recent rain had turned much of the field into mud, making movement difficult for cavalry and artillery. Wellington placed his troops behind the crest of the ridge, hidden from direct enemy fire, and waited. Napoleon arrived with his army and faced a decision: attack quickly or wait for better conditions. The heavy rain in the night had soaked the ground, making it hard for cannon to be moved and for cavalry to charge effectively. He delayed the main assault until later in the morning, hoping that the sun would dry the field. This delay has been much debated. Some argue that it was necessary. Others believe it gave Blücher time to bring Prussian reinforcements closer to the battlefield. When the French attack finally began, it opened with a massive artillery bombardment aimed at softening the Allied lines. Columns of infantry then advanced against the ridge and the fortified farms. The fighting around Hougoumont was especially fierce, with repeated French attempts to break through the British and Allied defenses. Despite relentless pressure, the defenders held, and the farm became a symbol of stubborn resistance. Elsewhere, French troops attacked the center and left of Wellington's line. At times, the situation looked dangerous for the Allies. La Haye-Sainte fell into French hands during the day, and several British units suffered heavy losses. French cavalry charges, led by Marshal Ney, swept up the slope in repeated waves, trying to break squares of infantry. The Allied soldiers, trained to form tight hedges of bayonets, stood their ground under tremendous pressure, while artillery fired into the charging cavalry when it came within range. Throughout the day, Wellington's strategy remained essentially defensive. He aimed to hold his position long enough for Blücher's Prussian army to arrive on Napoleon's flank. The key question was whether his lines could endure until that reinforcement appeared in sufficient strength. As the battle raged, dust, smoke, and confusion made it difficult for commanders on both sides to see the full picture. Reports of Prussian movements reached Napoleon, but he believed at first that his own subordinate, Marshal Grouchy, would keep them occupied away from the main battlefield. In reality, Grouchy had not managed to block the Prussians effectively. Led by Blücher, they marched toward the sound of the guns, determined to support Wellington. By afternoon, the first Prussian units began to arrive on Napoleon's right flank, near the village of Plancenoit. The French now faced a growing threat from the east, while still locked in heavy combat with Wellington in the center and west. Napoleon had to divert troops to meet the Prussian advance, weakening his efforts against the main Allied line. Fierce fighting erupted in and around Plancenoit as French and Prussian soldiers contested the village. For a time, the French held, but more Prussian troops arrived, increasing the pressure. The battlefield, once a relatively simple line of confrontation, had become a complex, shifting arena with danger on multiple fronts. As evening approached, Napoleon made a final attempt to break Wellington's center. He committed elements of the Imperial Guard, an elite formation that had long symbolized the core of his power. The Guard advanced up the slope, disciplined and imposing, but the Allies, reinforced and determined, stood firm. Musketry and artillery tore through the ranks. When the Guard was checked and then began to fall back, cries went up that it was retreating. For many French soldiers, the sight of the Guard withdrawing signaled that the battle was lost. Morale collapsed rapidly. Units that had fought hard for hours now broke and fled. The retreat turned into a rout as Prussian forces pressed in and Allied cavalry pursued. The carefully constructed Napoleonic battle plan dissolved in the chaos of defeat. Waterloo was not just another lost battle, it became the symbol of final, irreversible failure on the field. After Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte's world shrank with astonishing speed. In France, the political class that had once followed him now saw only danger in his presence. Abroad, the victors of the long wars were united on at least one point. This man must never again be allowed to dominate Europe. His second abdication sealed his fall, but his final destination would define the last years of his life and the shape of his memory. At first, Napoleon hoped he might find refuge in a neutral or distant country. He briefly considered fleeing to the United States, imagining a quiet life far from European intrigues. Instead, he surrendered to the British, trusting, or perhaps pretending to trust, in what he called the generosity of the English people. He may have expected to live as a private gentleman in Britain, watched but not imprisoned, perhaps writing his memoirs and commenting on politics from a distance. The British government, however, had no intention of allowing such an outcome. They remembered how Elba had served as a mere pause before the 100 Days. Britain, now the dominant naval and colonial power, chose a solution that reflected both fear and practicality. Napoleon would be sent to St. Helena, a tiny remote island in the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from Europe and from any major shore. It was a place difficult to reach and even harder to escape. St. Helena was a volcanic rock surrounded by steep cliffs and restless seas. A few small settlements clung to the slopes, with the main town, Jamestown, squeezed into a narrow valley running down to the harbor. The climate was damp, often windy, sometimes foggy, with sudden changes of weather. It was worlds away from the glittering palaces and battlefields where Napoleon had once moved. For the British, that was precisely the point. To guard this single captive, Britain deployed hundreds of soldiers and sailors, fortified the island, and kept a close watch over the surrounding waters. The governor appointed to oversee Napoleon's captivity was Sir Hudson Lowe, a conscientious but rigid officer whose personality would clash sharply with that of his famous prisoner. From the beginning, the relationship between the two men was tense. Lowe saw it as his duty to enforce strict security. Napoleon saw every restriction as an insult and an attempt to humiliate him. Napoleon's residence on the island, Longwood House, was set on a windswept plateau exposed to fog and rain. At first, the house was in poor condition, damp and drafty, with inadequate drainage and questionable sanitation. Though some improvements were made over time, Napoleon complained frequently about the climate and the lodging. Whether the conditions were truly as bad as he described or partly exaggerated for effect, they became central to his narrative of suffering. Despite the isolation, Napoleon was not entirely alone. A small group of devoted followers chose to accompany him into exile: generals, officers, servants, and a few members of the imperial household. Among them were figures like General Bertrand, General Montholon, and the Corsican valet Marchand. There was also the Irish surgeon O'Meara for a time, and later other doctors. These companions shared his daily routine, listened to his conversations, took down his words, and helped build the image that the world would later remember. Life on St. Helena settled into a pattern. Napoleon rose relatively late, often spent part of the morning reading or dictating, took short walks in the garden or on the surrounding hills, and occasionally rode on horseback while his health allowed it. He read widely: histories, classics, plays, and accounts of his own campaigns. He followed news from Europe as best he could, through newspapers and letters that passed British censorship. Meals were taken in common, with long discussions around the table, sometimes animated, sometimes melancholy. Central to his activity was the creation of his own version of history. In conversations with his companions, he recounted the events of his life and reign, explaining his decisions, justifying controversial actions, and criticizing his enemies. These talks were not casual reminiscences. They were a deliberate effort to shape how future generations would see him. The men around him took notes and later published memoirs that presented Napoleon as they had heard him describe himself: a misunderstood reformer, a soldier of the revolution, and a victim of the jealousy and fear of other rulers. In this self-portrait, Napoleon emphasized his role in consolidating the achievements of the French Revolution: equality before the law, the end of feudal privileges, the secular state, and the opening of careers to talent. He argued that his wars had been defensive, forced upon him by coalitions that could not accept a strong, modern France. Even his harshest measures, he suggested, were responses to the necessities of conflict and to the treachery of others. He compared himself favorably to older dynasties, portraying them as reactionary and unjust. At the same time, Napoleon presented his exile as an example of British cruelty and hypocrisy. He criticized the choice of St. Helena as a prison island, the behavior of Sir Hudson Lowe, and the restrictions placed on his movements and correspondence. He claimed that the climate and conditions at Longwood were damaging his health and that he was being slowly killed by neglect. These complaints found eager listeners among those already inclined to see Britain as a harsh and calculating power. For the British authorities, the problem was delicate. They wanted to prevent escape and to ensure that Napoleon remained politically harmless, but they did not seek to make him a martyr by obvious physical mistreatment. Sir Hudson Lowe, anxious and suspicious, enforced regulations closely and clashed with Napoleon over matters both small and large: access to newspapers, visits from travelers, the wording of official titles, and the terms of his confinement. Their personal antipathy deepened Napoleon's anger and colored his stories. As years passed, Napoleon's health gradually declined. He suffered from stomach pains, weakness, and bouts of fever. Some of his symptoms resembled those of his father, who had died relatively young, possibly of stomach cancer. On St. Helena, limited medical knowledge, poor diet, and the damp environment may have worsened his condition. Doctors debated diagnoses and treatments, sometimes disagreeing among themselves, while the patient himself alternated between cooperation and suspicion. Even as his body weakened, Napoleon continued to shape his legend. He spoke of destiny, of the great things he had accomplished, and of the ingratitude or blindness of those who had overthrown him. He drew comparisons with figures from classical and ancient history, from Alexander the Great to Caesar, positioning himself in a long line of world-changing leaders. To his listeners, he appeared as both a commanding personality and a tragic figure, a man who had held enormous power and now lived under guard on a distant island. Back in Europe, opinions about Napoleon during these years were far from uniform. Among conservative rulers and ministers, especially those gathered around Metternich and other architects of the post-war order, he remained a dangerous symbol of revolution and war. They sought to suppress Napoleonic imagery and ideas, fearing that admiration for the fallen emperor might inspire new uprisings. Among liberal and nationalist circles, however, a different view began to take shape. Some saw Napoleon as the man who had shattered feudal structures and spread ideas of equality and merit, even if by force. The Romantic movement, emerging in literature and art during this period, found in Napoleon a compelling subject. Poets, painters, and intellectuals were drawn to the contrast between his extraordinary rise and his lonely exile. They turned him into a symbol not only of power, but of the tragic hero, a figure who reached for greatness, challenged the old order, and then fell, perhaps because of his own excesses, perhaps because the world was not ready for him. The image of Napoleon walking alone on the cliffs of St. Helena, staring out at the endless sea, fed this romantic vision. Napoleon died on St. Helena in the early 1820s, surrounded by a small circle of faithful companions. His last days were marked by increasing weakness and pain. Witnesses reported that he spoke of France, of the army, and of his son, the young boy known as the King of Rome, who lived under strict supervision in Austria. Allegedly, the word France was among his final utterances, though such details are often shaped by the needs of memory as much as by strict fact. After his death, an autopsy was performed, and his body was buried on the island in a simple grave, shaded by willow trees, with no name on the tombstone at first, due to disagreements over how he should be described. For the time being, it seemed that his remains and his story would remain confined to that distant rock, overseen by British authorities, far from the country he had ruled. Yet the legend he had crafted did not stay confined. Accounts by those who had lived with him on St. Helena began to circulate in Europe. These works, sometimes sympathetic to the point of worship, portrayed Napoleon as the champion of modernity, the victim of reactionary powers, and a man of immense intellect and will. Critics responded with their own writings, emphasizing the human cost of his wars and the authoritarian nature of his rule. A debate began that would continue for generations. Was Napoleon a tyrant or a great reformer, a monster or a genius, or some uneasy blend of both? In France, the political climate shifted over time. the restored Bourbon monarchy struggled with internal opposition and competing memories of the Revolution and the Empire. Among veterans of the Grande Armée and among sections of the urban middle class, nostalgia for Napoleon remained strong. The tricolor flag, the imperial eagle, and the very name of the emperor carried emotional weight. Over the years, petitions and commemorations kept his memory alive. When Napoleon Bonaparte died on St. Helena, his empire was gone, but the world he had helped create was still taking shape. The cannons had fallen silent, borders had been redrawn, and old dynasties had returned, yet the clock could not simply be turned back to the days before the French Revolution. The Napoleonic era left an imprint on politics, law, society, and memory that extended far beyond the shores of France and long after his own lifetime. One of the most lasting elements of that legacy was legal. The civil code that Napoleon pushed through during the Consulate, often called the Napoleonic Code, did not disappear with his fall. Instead, it spread. In France, it remained the foundation of private law, governing matters such as property, contracts, inheritance, and family relations. In territories that had been under French rule or influence, versions of the code continued in force even after foreign troops withdrew. Some states kept large portions of it because it offered clarity and predictability compared with the tangled local customs that had existed before. Over time, many countries in continental Europe, Latin America, and beyond adopted civil codes influenced by the Napoleonic model. They did not always copy it word for word, but they borrowed its structure and many of its principles: equality of citizens before the law, the protection of private property, secular civil authority, and the idea that laws should be written, coherent, and accessible. In this sense, Napoleon's impact on legal culture was both deep and enduring. Long after the last veterans of his army had died, courts were still applying rules that could be traced back to his reforms. The administrative system he helped build also outlived him. The centralized model of government, with clearly defined territorial divisions and a hierarchy of appointed officials, became a pattern for many modern states. Prefects and similar roles, even when renamed, embodied the idea that the central government should have direct representatives in provinces, able to implement policies uniformly. This contrasted with older forms of rule based on semi-independent local nobles, guilds, or corporate privileges. The Napoleonic administrative style was efficient, sometimes rigid, and very modern. In education, too, the influence continued. The network of state schools, the emphasis on standardized curricula, and the link between schooling and careers in administration or the military helped shape the 19th century ideal of a merit-based elite. Young men who entered the lycées or similar schools across Europe gained a common language of history, mathematics, and civic duty. Even where critics opposed Napoleon's politics, they often kept his educational structures because they met the needs of a society that was becoming more complex and industrial. At the political level, Napoleon's career acted as both an inspiration and a warning. For many liberals and nationalists in the 19th century, he remained the man who had smashed the old feudal order and carried the ideals of the revolution across the continent, even if by force. In places like Italy and Germany, his reorganization of small states, the abolition of certain feudal rights, and the reintroduction of rational administration unintentionally prepared the ground for later unification movements. Though he did not aim to create unified Italian or German nations, his restructuring made the old patchwork of microstates harder to restore. In the decades after his fall, national movements rose in many parts of Europe. Italians dreaming of unification, Germans seeking to create a single nation, Poles hoping to revive their lost state, and others all looked back at the Napoleonic era in complex ways. Some remembered the emperor as a liberator, others as a conqueror who had used their lands for his wars. Yet they often drew on the language of popular sovereignty and national pride that had been strengthened during his campaigns and the resistance to them. The Napoleonic period thus helped to awaken national consciousness, both through his rule and through the opposition it provoked. The conservative order established at the Congress of Vienna aimed to keep revolutionary and Napoleonic forces under control. Metternich and other statesmen built a system of alliances and congresses to preserve stability, repress uprisings, and protect dynastic legitimacy. For a time, they succeeded in preventing large-scale continental war. Yet, beneath this apparently calm surface, ideas that had spread during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic years continued to circulate. Demands for constitutions, civil rights, and national self-determination did not disappear. When revolutions and movements erupted in the middle of the 19th century, from Paris to Vienna to Budapest, they carried echoes of the earlier era. Napoleon also influenced the way later leaders thought about power and legitimacy. His rise from obscure origins to imperial rank suggested that talent and energy could overturn the established order. His use of plebiscites, referendums, and carefully staged public rituals showed how a modern ruler could claim popular support while still exercising strong, often personal, authority. Politicians and rulers across the world studied his example, sometimes seeking to imitate him, sometimes determined to avoid his mistakes. In France itself, his memory played a direct role in politics. The return of his remains to Paris and their burial under the Great Dome of Les Invalides turned him into a national symbol. Different regimes claimed him in different ways. Monarchists tried to contain his image as a brilliant but dangerous figure from the past. Republicans emphasized his origins in the Revolution and his reforms, while criticizing his authoritarian turn. Bonapartists, a political tendency of their own, used his name and fame to argue for strong leadership combined with national pride. This memory shaped the careers of later French leaders, most notably Napoleon III, his nephew, who came to power in the middle of the 19th century. Napoleon III deliberately wrapped himself in the legend of his uncle, presenting himself as the man who would complete the mission of social progress and national greatness. He used referendums, public works, and a carefully managed press in ways that echoed earlier Napoleonic methods, blending modern mass politics with a cult of personality. In this sense, the first Napoleon's shadow stretched forward through dynastic and ideological lines. Beyond politics and law, the Napoleonic era left psychological and cultural marks. The experience of mass conscription and national armies, mobilized not just as hired forces but as citizen soldiers, became a model for later conflicts. The idea that nations could call entire generations to arms, and that war involved not only professional troops but societies as a whole, was reinforced by Napoleon's practices. The modern concept of total war, fully realized only in later centuries, had some of its roots in the mobilizations and campaigns of this period. At the same time, the human cost of those wars remained etched in memory. Families across Europe remembered sons who had marched away in the Grande Armée and never returned, or in the armies that fought against it and fell in foreign fields. Veterans carried scars, both physical and emotional, into their later lives. Writers and artists addressed themes of glory and suffering, heroism and waste, in poems, novels, paintings, and music. The image of the lone soldier, the shattered army, and the snowbound retreat from Russia became part of a shared European imagination. In literature, Napoleon became a symbol used in many different ways. Romantic poets portrayed him as a fallen titan, a figure who had dared too much and paid the price. Realist novelists examined the impact of his wars on ordinary lives, showing how grand events filtered down into villages and city neighborhoods. In historical writing, debates raged over his intentions and his character. Was he the heir of the revolution, spreading emancipation, or a military dictator who betrayed its ideals? Depending on the author and the era, he appeared as a genius, a tyrant, a necessary evil, or a tragic figure. Outside Europe, the Napoleonic period also had consequences. In Latin America, the weakening of Spanish authority during the French invasion of the Iberian Peninsula created openings for independence movements. Leaders like Simón Bolívar and others rose in a context shaped in part by the crisis of the Spanish monarchy under Napoleonic pressure. The idea that colonial rule could be challenged and that new nations could emerge was strengthened by the wider upheavals of the time. Even the British Empire, which had opposed Napoleon so fiercely, was changed by the struggle. Victory confirmed Britain's naval supremacy and opened the way for a century in which it would act as a global imperial power. The long effort to defeat France had required financial innovation, industrial growth, and the forging of new alliances, all of which left their mark on British society and its role in the world. Looking back from the later 19th and 20th centuries, historians and thinkers often used Napoleon's career as a case study in the dangers of unchecked ambition and the complexity of revolutionary change. Some saw in him a prototype of later authoritarian figures who used mass politics and war to hold power. Others emphasized the genuine modernizing aspects of his rule, the legal codes, the end of feudal remnants, and the promotion of merit. The tension between these interpretations reflects the dual nature of his legacy. On one side, there is the Napoleon who codified laws, opened careers to talent, and helped build the framework of the modern centralized state. On the other side, there is the Napoleon who waged nearly continuous war, imposed his will on many peoples, and left countless dead in his wake. These two faces cannot be fully separated. The same energy and organizational ability that created useful institutions also fed the drive for conquest. His achievements and his crimes are intertwined. For viewers today, the story of the Napoleonic Empire invites questions that go beyond the 1800s. How should we judge leaders who bring both reform and destruction? Can great changes be made without great violence, or is that belief itself a hopeful illusion? When does the pursuit of national glory cross the line into reckless overreach? The history of Napoleon's rise and fall does not give simple answers, but it provides a rich field for thinking about these issues. What is clear is that the world after Napoleon was not the same as the world before him. Borders had shifted, but more importantly, ideas about law, citizenship, state power, and national identity had changed. Monarchs returned, yet they ruled societies that had tasted revolution and seen the power of mobilized publics. Armies could no longer be thought of as small, separate castes. They had become instruments of whole nations. Subjects had begun to think of themselves as citizens, even in places where full rights were still denied. The Napoleonic Empire, in its short and turbulent life, accelerated the transition from the old order of estates and dynastic politics toward the modern age of nations and mass politics. Its legal and administrative structures, its wars and its defeats, its propaganda and its myths, all helped to push Europe and the wider world into a new era. To follow Napoleon's story from Corsica to Moscow, from Austerlitz to St. Helena, is to watch a bridge being crossed between two different centuries, one still rooted in monarchy and hierarchy, the other struggling toward modern forms of power, identity, and conflict that are, in many ways, still with us today. Still with us today.